Hey everybody, welcome to All Fiction is Fantasy. This is my new channel. It is spun off from a channel I started about 5 years ago called The Dungeon Dive. The Dungeon Dive was a channel, or is a channel, focused on fantasy and science fiction adventure gaming, tabletop gaming, and I also did book reviews focusing on science fiction and fantasy books. I am spinning off a new channel that's going to be devoted strictly to books, and that is All Fiction is Fantasy. One of the big projects that I'm working on is a series called the Sword and Sorcery Saga, in which I am reviewing tons of works of appendix in fiction, sword and sorcery, sword and planet, kind of heroic fiction, all of that kind of combined together. And I've done about 12 or 13 episodes of that so far on the Dungeon Dive. But here I'm combining all of those episodes into one super cut to kick off this channel. All new episodes of this series will be on this channel. All Fiction is Fantasy. And so I just wanted to kind of put them all together. I'm going to keep the individual episodes on the Dungeon Dive. I'm not going to move those. But this new supercut will be on this channel, and all subsequent videos will be on this channel. So I hope you guys enjoy this channel. I hope you guys enjoy this project. It's a lot of fun. We are going to be taking the first new episode on this channel is going to be a look at basically my entire kind of appendix in bookshelf as kind of like a roadmap of where we are going with the channel and with this series. So, well, I hope you enjoy it. Take it easy. Bye-bye. Hey everyone, welcome back to the Dungeon Dive. Daniel here. Alright, so this video is going to serve as a kind of introduction to my Sword and Sorcery Saga series, and You could think of it as what is sword and sorcery. Now, I am no expert, not even close. For every book I've read in the genre, there are probably 10 I haven't read, and I have a feeling that people who are going to be commenting on these videos probably know a lot more than I do. That's usually how things go, right? But in this series, we will be looking at 3 kinds of related subgenres, and all of them are subgenres of fantasy. And those are sword and sorcery, sword and planet, and heroic fantasy. Now, there's going to be one major caveat, is I will not be spending a lot of time with Robert E. Howard's Conan. That's not to say that I'm going to avoid that author or character entirely. You know, if a Conan story appears in an anthology, I will look at it and read it. And we will also be looking at other Robert E. Howard creations. I'm just not going to focus on Conan just because there's so much coverage of the character and his stories already on YouTube and the internet. So Sword and Sorcery and Sword and Planet stories probably date back roughly to the early 30s, 1932 according to Lynn Carter, who says that Robert E. Howard invented the genre. Sword and Planet is probably quite a bit earlier. And those are like with examples like Edgar Rice Burroughs, his planetary romances, the Princess of Mars, and those kinds of stories. Sword and Sorcery can largely be defined by the stories that appeared in the pages of Weird Tales, as well as early anthologies and pulp magazines. Anthologies collected and edited by L. Sprague de Camp, and later by Lynn Carter and others. The term was most likely coined by Fritz Leiber, the creator of the Fafhrd and Grey Mouser stories, sometime after the first of its stories were published, again according to Lynn Carter. I say according to Lynn Carter, take this with a grain of salt. While I love everything he did for genre fiction and appreciate, just everything he's done for fantasy fiction specifically, there are some more in the know than myself who accuse Carter of being a little fast and loose with the facts. An easy way for us to define these kinds of stories is as follows. These are largely the kinds of stories that have inspired and informed the kinds of games I cover on the Dungeon Dive, the kinds of games we like to play. You could say that most of the games that I cover on the Dungeon Dive, the kinds of games we love, were all largely inspired by Dungeons and Dragons in some way. And D&D includes a famous list of fiction which inspired it, and that would be Appendix N. So another name for this genre could be Appendix N fiction, although the fiction found on Appendix N covers a wider range of subgenres that I'm going to cover in this series. For some, the term heroic fantasy is synonymous with sword and sorcery, and for other, the term predates sword and sorcery, predates it all, and is pretty much like it can be found at the genesis in the very myths and legends that all of our modern stories are built upon. The Greek and Roman mythologies are examples of heroic fantasy. I guess in many ways the heroic tales found in the world's ancient myths, legends, really are the true genesis of all of these ideas, but I'm not going to be covering that kind of stuff. But things get messy when you start defining a genre. Is aliens science fiction or horror? Is aliens science fiction, horror, or action? There are always works that span multiple genres, some things that people consider one while others consider another, and things that don't fit nicely into one genre. We define genres really just to create a kind of roadmap, or a large box that we can put things in for the purpose of discussion. In other words, I may not be able to define it, but I know it when I see it. And other people will sometimes agree or disagree. And it's useful purely for the sake of discussions and for making lists like this. It's useful but not crucial. And I'm sure there will be some arguments about some things I'm leaving out or some things I am including, and that is fine. One of the best ways to define a subgenre is to look at the stories that have been anthologized in that subgenre's most respected collections by that subgenre's most respected editors. And that's largely what I will be doing. Folks like L. Sprague de Camp and Lynn Carter, they will be kind of my guides through this subgenre. These are the experts, these are the people and others that I will be turning to on this quest. Here are some of the elements that I think separate sword and sorcery from other forms of fantasy fiction like high fantasy and epic fantasy. One, the stories and novels are usually shorter. If you put up 20 novels on a shelf with their covers covered and told somebody to pick the examples of sword and sorcery out, if they just picked the slimmest volumes, they would probably pick 100% correctly. They are not two, they are not epic in scope. Three, they are not as concerned with world building as they are with depicting exciting scenarios. Think of high and epic fantasy as a campaign source book, and think of sword and sorcery as the adventure module. Four, the fate of the world usually is not threatened. Five, the heroes in these stories are just trying to survive to make ends meet. Six, the heroes are usually less altruistic, more selfish, in it to win it, to get that loot, to get paid, to get revenge. Seven, they're usually more humorous, bawdy, violent, and flippant. A great example of many of these elements can be found in the Fafhrd and Grey Mouser novel, The Swords of Lankhmar. Sword and Planet, also known as planetary romance, is sword and sorcery in space. This fiction will usually take the ideas above and add a couple important elements, such as one, they're usually fish out of water stories in which a hero from Earth is somehow teleported to another very alien planet. Two, these stories are absolutely not concerned with how the science part works. All planets have Earth-like atmospheres. Technology is magic, magic is technology. These stories usually deal with the hero trying to get back home. They take place in science fiction and post-apocalyptic settings, and will sometimes examine the clash between ancient and modern technology, swords versus lasers. I think Star Wars: A New Hope is really an example of a sword and planet. One thing to remember is that setting doesn't always dictate the genre. Sword and sorcery on Mars is not science fiction, it's science fantasy or sword and planet. These are just some of the things I've noticed while reading some of this fiction. They're not being presented as the one and only true definitions of these subgenres. Again, I'm just kind of creating a map for us to work from. We will need to address one thing, and it's kind of a touchy subject, and that is the misogyny and depictions of women in these stories. I just recently picked up the Taschen huge, like 20-pound coffee table book, Masterworks of Fantasy Art. And my wife and I were looking through it, and she commented that, just every single page there is a naked woman. And it's true. But also, a lot of times, the men are also almost as naked. We need to address the cover art. The cover art you're seeing in this video are all books that I am considering for this series. So it's no secret that I love vintage paperback art and vintage paperbacks. I collect them because of the art, and I love the pictures that you are seeing. But a lot of the pictures are of naked or half-naked people on the covers, both men and women. The depictions of men and women on these covers are incredibly idealized. And that is something that all of the artists talk openly about, male and female artists in that Taschen book. I would argue that sword and sorcery really is part of a larger body genre. These are works of fiction, mainly films like martial arts films, that worship and fetishize the human body in some idealized peak form. And it's probably a holdover from the ancient myths and legends which did the same. The men on the covers of these books have great butts with thick muscular legs, chiseled abs and chest, square jaws, tree trunk arms, and the women often do too, but with breasts. And both are usually wearing nothing more than tattered loincloths, if that. However, one of the big differences is that men are more often than not in positions of power, while the women are more often than not the victims, the captives, and the rewards to be won by the men. I know this isn't always the case, but it happens to be a norm. I will be pointing this out when I see it and read it. This doesn't mean that I dislike these stories or authors, or I don't want people to read them. Quite the contrary. I think we should still be reading these stories, and it's important to discuss their good and their problematic qualities. The misogyny issues, these aren't being brought up to end discussion, they're being brought up to start discussion. Same as the racism that can be prevalent in some of these early stories, and same as the otherness, the other being the enemy. And I will also be looking at examples that buck these trends and spending time researching and reading women authors who write in this genre about women heroes. So that is about it. The rest of this video is going to play out for a few minutes with some music I wrote, with showing some more covers. And so I really hope you guys enjoy this series. It's going to be a long one. I'm going to try to do maybe one video a month. It's going to be a slow series because I need to read these books. I'm going to try to cover 2 to 3 books on each episode. The first official episode will be covering 3 classic anthologies from L. Spragda Camp. So alright guys, well I hope you enjoyed this and we will talk to you later. Bye bye. Hey everybody, welcome back to the Dungeon Dive. Daniel here. Alright, I just wanted to do a really quick video to address the topic of genre semantics. And I wanted to get out in front of this before my first big review of the Sword and Sorcery Saga project. So I've been toying with the idea of renaming this series the Heroic Fantasy Saga, or something like that, something that is more inclusive. Because I know there will be some people who have very strict definitions of what is and what is not sword and sorcery. But after doing some research, I've decided not to, because really even the experts can't seem to agree.
People like Elsbreg de Camp and Lynn Carter, they use the terms heroic fantasy and sword and sorcery interchangeably in many of their introductions and in many of their writings about the genre. They seem to be far more inclusive with what is in the genre. I have recently been watching some panels from the Howard Days, a con devoted to Robert E. Howard and Conan, with authors such as David C. Smith and others. And they seem to be very strict with how they define sword and sorcery. Some of them even claiming that these are not heroic fantasy stories. Sometimes it seems like some of these authors define it so narrowly that only Conan is sword and sorcery. But then I was just reading Karl Edward Wagner's introduction to the Conan Red Nails collection that he edited, and in his introduction he calls all of these stories epic fantasy. So when the experts can't even come to a consensus of what to call this, what it is, what it isn't, I've decided that I am not going to worry about it. I will continue to call this series the Sword and Sorcery Saga. And if I include something that is a little out of left field, which I am probably going to do, I will make sure to make my case for its inclusion. So I've decided to be more inclusive. One definition that I did like was that it's easier to define sword and sorcery by what it is not. So that is something to keep in mind as this series progresses. And then, of course, if people complain about what I include or what I don't include, in which they definitely will, well, unless they're more expert in the genre than de Camp, Carter, Smith, and Wagner and others, I'll just point them to this video for my reasoning. So stay tuned. The first official episode with reviews for the stories in Spell of Seven, Swords and Sorcery, and Warlocks and Warriors, all anthologies edited by Elsbreg de Camp, will be coming soon. Thanks for watching, and we'll talk to you later. Bye-bye. Hey everybody, welcome back to the Dungeon Dive. Daniel here, and welcome finally to the first official episode of the Sword and Sorcery Saga project. And with some reviews finally for 3 anthologies from Elsbreg de Camp, including Swords and Sorcery, The Spell of Seven, and Warlocks and Warriors. So I think I bit off a little more than I should have for this original episode, because in these 3 collections, it's nearly 30 stories, and I wrote almost 15 pages of notes while reading. Rest assured, I'm not going to be referencing all 15 pages of notes for this episode, but also keep in mind it is going to be a long episode, so maybe save this for a time when you can really kick back with a nice beverage and listen or watch. I am I'm going to be honest, a little apprehensive and nervous about starting this project. And a lot of that does have to do with the die-hard fans of this genre. I'm not sure I have ever encountered a more passionate group of fans. Very, very passionate fans in the sword and sorcery genre. Unfortunately, there is a lot of gatekeeping mentality in this genre. And I kind of want to not participate in that. I kind of feel like if I say one wrong thing or disagree with the consensus, and it's going to be like, bam, these people are ready to pounce because they've taken this genre so close to their heart. And I understand that. I mean, it's easy. I mean, it's fun to be super passionate about things, but I just want people to know that I'm using this project is a quest of exploration, a quest of knowledge. This is a journey of discovery for me, because while I have dove deep into some of these authors and some of these characters and stories, my general knowledge is lacking. And so that's really why I have wanted to do this project for so long. That's the whole point of this project, a quest for knowledge. I have collected over 200 books to potentially read over the next couple years. So when it's all said and done, you and I should both have a pretty deep and wide knowledge of the sword and sorcery, sword and planet, and heroic fantasy genres, whatever you want to call this fiction. I am taking this project very seriously, but remember, I am not an expert. I'm just a dude, I'm just a guy who likes some things, as I am prone to say. But I am coming at this project as someone who wants to learn, which is why I've chosen these 3 anthologies as a starting point, because I think it is important to when you are getting into a new kind of fiction. If you take a look at the anthologies, excuse me, of the important anthologies, the revered anthologies, you can use that editor as a guide. You can use that the anthologies as a roadmap to get more into this fiction. And so that's what I have done. So our first volume here is Swords and Sorcery. And Swords and Sorcery was published in 1963. And this does have a cover and some interior art by Virgil Finlay, the one and only, the great Virgil Finlay. You know, eventually we are going to have to be do some episodes on the artists for these books, because the art is such an important and integral part of inviting fans into the genre. I also think it is important to look at the introductions as written by DeCamp. But this particular volume, which is one of the earlier anthologies that we will be taking a look at, but it includes The Valor of Captain Vara by Paul Anderson, The Distressing Tale of Thanglebrine the Jeweler by Lord Dunsany, Shadows in the Moonlight by Robert Howard, The Citadel of Darkness by Harry Kuttner, When the Sea Kings Away by Fritz Leiber, The Doom That Came to Sarnoff by H.P. Lovecraft, Hell's Guard by C.L. Moore, and The Testament of Athamas by Clark Ashton Smith. I did skip Hell's Guard by C.L. Moore. That is a Jarell of Jory story. There are so few of those, like only 5 or 6, that we are going to be covering all of those in a single episode when I get to that collection. So in this introduction by DeCamp, I do think it is important to pay special attention to these introductions, especially when you are first getting into a certain kind of literature. We can learn a lot from how the editors word their introduction and who they mention. So in this introduction, DeCamp describes heroic fantasy thusly. Heroic fantasy is the name of a class of stories laid not in the world as it is or was or will be, but as it ought to have been to make a good story. So that's kind of an interesting way to look at heroic fantasy, which he does call this genre heroic fantasy. He goes on to saying that all these are stories where all men were mighty, all women were beautiful, all problems were simple, and all life was adventurous. He argues that these stories were not written as allegory or metaphor, but were written not written to teach lessons or pontificate on life's grander meaning. These stories were written solely to entertain, to enthrall, to excite, and to astonish. I don't necessarily agree with that these are pure escapism. And that's one thing that I do want to look at in going through this project. Many of these early stories from the 1930s, when the sword and sorcery genre really came to light with Howard, are definitely Depression era stories. The entire rise of pulp fiction was birthed out of the Great Depression, of offering entertainment cheaply to people who needed it. But that wasn't pure escapism, because those types of problems and lives were reflected in these stories. These Depression era fantasy stories were about people, specifically men, who were just trying to survive. They were survival stories. You had these men during the Depression who, back then it was very common to tie your entire persona into your job, into being the breadwinner for your family. And when that was ripped away with unemployment, you know, a lot of these men found themselves with their backs up against it, and they needed to find out how to survive and how to be who they were. And I think that is evident in a lot of the early sword and sorcery stories. And that is like from the first wave. And then as we move on closer to the Vietnam War, and I think maybe like the second wave of sword and sorcery, I think we see that some of the stories become allegories for the Vietnam War. One story we're going to be taking a look at a little later is definitely a Vietnam allegory. So I think it's important to look at when the stories were written and what we can learn about them and the way that they reflected the time in which they were written, while also recognizing the fact that they were written to entertain. But in this introduction, he gives a brief survey of fantasy fiction starting back, you know, in the late 1800s with William Morris and George MacDonald, two early fantasy authors that I am familiar with. He then moves on to Zelazny and then Tolkien, and into the pages of the Weird Tales and the pulps of the 1930s. So my three favorite stories in this collection. The first is Shadows in the Moonlight by Robert E. Howard, published in 1934. Now, I know in my introduction to the series, I said I wasn't going to be focusing on Howard, on Conan, but I wasn't going to be actively avoiding Conan. And it is impossible to actively avoid Conan. And this story is a perfect example of why, because it is such a prototypical and just great story of sword and sorcery and adventure. In this story, Conan, he accidentally rescues an escaped slave woman named Olivia, and Olivia ends up being like one of only 2 or 3 like really well-written female characters from all 3 of these anthologies, and she's really cool. And Conan and Olivia, they take turns rescuing each other and helping one another. They share this wonderfully charming relationship that was quite surprising to me. I had never read this story before. And in this story, Conan accidentally rescues her, and then together they fight off a group of pirates. They fight a massive beast of a primate, and they avoid the ensorcelled grasps of these magical metal men that reminded me of the 18 bronze men of the Shaolin, if you guys are familiar with that movie and that trope from Kung Fu cinema. And then at the end, Conan promises to make Olivia his fair companion, the queen of the pirates, as they embark aboard this pirate vessel and sail off into the horizon. Very good story. I absolutely loved it. My second favorite story in this collection was from Zelazny, and that is the distressing tale of Thengilbrine the Jeweler, with a jeweler being a kind of a synonym for a thief. Now, in his typical style of brevity, in just a few pages, Zelazny lays out this entire epic quest for this jewel called the Dead Man's Diamond that is at the altar of a spider god named Lolo. And he does an amazing job of detailing this quest in only a few pages. What any other author would probably take an entire book to describe, Zelazny does it in like 5 pages. And I did want to read this amazing paragraph here for you guys. How nimbly he threaded his way through the pits of Snood, now like a botanist scrutinizing the ground, now like a dancer leaping from crumbling edges. It was quite dark when he went by the towers of Tor, where archers shoot ivory arrows at strangers, lest any foreigner should alter their laws, which are bad, but not to be altered by mere aliens. At night they shoot at the sound of the stranger's feet. O Thengilbrine, Thengilbrine, was ever a jeweler like you? He dragged 2 stones with him by long cords, and at these the archers shot. Tempting indeed was the snare that set in Woth, the emeralds loose set in the city's gate. But Thengilbrine discerned the golden cord that climbed the wall from each, and the weights that would topple upon him if he touched one. And so he left them, though he left them weeping. And at last he came to Theth. There all men worship Lolo, though they are willing to believe in other gods, as missionaries attest, but only as creatures of the chase, for the hunting of Lolo, who wears their halos, so these people say, on golden hooks along his hunting belt. And from Theth he came to the city of Mung and the temple of Mongaling, and entered and saw the spider idol Lolo sitting there with dead man's diamond glittering on his lap, and looking for all the world like a full moon, but a full moon seen by a lunatic who had slept too long in its rays. For there was dead man's diamond, a certain sinister look, and a brooding of and a boding of things to happen that are better not mentioned here. The face of the spider god was lit by that fatal gem, and there was no other light. In spite of his shocking limbs and the demonic body, his face was serene and apparently unconscious. Wow! Just, man, what a paragraph. So good. If you're familiar with Dan Zanny, you know what a good writer he is, but his prose was just head and shoulders towering over his contemporaries. But now we're to my favorite story in this collection, and a very surprising one, and that is from Henry Kuttner in 1939, The Citadel of Darkness. Now, before I started this project, I only knew Kuttner as a writer of science fiction. I didn't know that he had written this kind of sword and sorcery and adventure and heroic fiction, and he has proven to me in these three collections to be just a master at this genre, and I'm so looking forward to reading more. And this is perhaps the most typical sword and sorcery in this collection, and it reads almost like a Dungeons and Dragons module. So this story focuses on a character named Prince Raynar and his Nubian servant slash bodyguard Elric. And it is their heroic quest to infiltrate the Citadel of Darkness and vanquish an evil sorcerer named Karr. So Elric being a Nubian, it's mentioned numerous times, as is his black skin. And while Raynar is obviously in a position of power over his companion, there is a mutual respect between the two that does transcend this master-slave dynamic. So I enjoyed their relationship, and I think it transcends the problematic genesis of the master-slave dynamic. But this heroic adventure here is just amazing. It has a series of chamber tests and traps that the heroes must overcome in various ways, including things like the sign of the basilisk, the sign of the black flower, the sign of the serpent, and the sign of the fish of Ea. You know, each being more deadly than the last. This really does feel like you are reading an outline for a game that I might cover on this on the Dungeon Dive. It's so much fun. Just perfect amount of adventure and plot. Super well written, so highly recommended The Citadel of Darkness and Henry Kuttner. I think I might have said Harry Kuttner earlier, and I apologize for that. But yeah, it is in fact Henry Kuttner. I don't know why I keep saying Harry. If I've said Harry, I apologize. All right, so next we're moving on to the Spell of Seven. Oh, I think I should mention two stories that I didn't quite like. Let's back up. Two stories I didn't quite like in Swords and Sorcery, and those were from two masters. And that is The Doom That Came to Sarnath from H.P. Lovecraft, published in 1935, and The Testament of Athamas from Clark Ashton Smith in 1932. Both of those stories feel really out of place here. They aren't really adventurous. They're very passive. They don't have that like immediate power and that immediate raw energy that so many of the stories in this genre do. I do absolutely love some Clark Ashton Smith, and I do love some H.P. Lovecraft, but those two stories just really didn't do it for me in this collection. So now we're looking at The Spell of Seven, and that was published in 1965. This is my favorite cover art of the three, one of my favorite covers of all time. And that, of course, is also done by Virgil Finlay. In this introduction, DeCamp says, "Do you feel like saying to hell with the world's problems for a while? Let's read something for fun." And to that, I say hurrah. Especially in 2020 and 2021, which there just seems to be a lot of crap going on in the world. So it's nice to read something like this. So this collection contains the following: Bazaar of the Bazaar by Fritz Leiber, The Dark Eidolon, Clark Ashton Smith, The Horde of Giblins, Lord Dunsany, The Hungry Hercynian by L. Sprague de Camp, Kings in Darkness by Michael Moorcock, Missourian the Magician from Jack Vance, and Shadows in Zambula from Robert E. Howard. So my third favorite story here is Kings in Darkness from Michael Moorcock, 1962, and that is an Elric story. In doing some research, according to Michael Moorcock, this was originally outlined as a Conan story by James Cawthorne. Now, James Cawthorne is an artist who worked with Moorcock and really helped develop the look of the Elric character. And we are going to be devoting an episode in the future to James Cawthorne's art. According to De Camp in his introduction, this was one of Moorcock's least favorite Elric stories, but I happen to really like it. Now, knowing that it was a Conan story, maybe you can tell it's a little more adventurous, it's a little more full of bravado than some of the Elric stories, but I don't think it reads too much like a Conan story. But here we are joining Elric and his odd-faced human companion Moonglum, and those two, while traveling, they meet a woman named Zarazonia, who Zarazonia later becomes, I think, Elric's wife. She becomes Elric's wife, if I'm remembering correctly. But Elric and Moonglum, they take on a quest to escort Zarazonia back to her homeland. But as we know, no good deed goes unpunished. Soon the three are they're ambushed by bandits. All of their possessions are stolen, so they have to infiltrate the bandits' camp to get their stuff back. And in doing so, they discover this strange cult. This god is resurrected, and they have to battle against these like warlock powers, these magical forces. And it's such a great example of that no good deed goes unpunished trope. It perfectly illustrates one of the things I love about the Elric stories is this balance of humor and gloom, and especially Elric's banter with his companions is really well done, and I think Moorcock perfectly exemplified in this story. My second favorite story, here we're going to come to the love part of the love-hate relationship with Clark Ashton Smith, and that is The Dark Eidolon in 1953. Damn it, what a fantastic story. This thing is just brilliant. It's so twisted, brutal, and devious. I can almost picture Quentin Tarantino directing a version of this because it reads like this weird fantasy grindhouse story of revenge. It's all about this young street orphan who is trampled by a lord's horse. He leaves the city, the orphan does. He learns sorcery and like necromancy, and then he returns to the city to get revenge on the lord that left him for dead. And I do want to read a passage from this story here. In the wide intervals between the tables, the familiars of Nemerah and his other servants went to and fro incessantly, as if a phantasmagoria of ill dreams were embodied before the emperor. Kingly cadavers in robes of time-rotten brocade, with worms seething in their eye pits, poured a blood-like wine into cups of the opalescent horn of unicorns. Lamias, trident-tailed and four-breasted chimeras, came in with fuming platters lifted high by their brazen claws. Dark-headed devils, tongued with lolling flames, ran forward to offer themselves as ushers for the company. And before Zetula and Obexa, there appeared a curious being with the full-fleshed lower limbs and hips of a great black woman, and the clean-picked bones of some titanic ape from there upward. And this monster signified by certain indescribable becks of its finger bones that the emperor and his odalisque were to follow it. Man, talk about evocative prose there. So grotesque and just eerie. Very good story of revenge. My number one favorite story in this collection is The Bazaar of the Bazaar, Fritz Leiber, Fafhrd and Grey Mouser story, 1963. I want to be careful with how much we cover Fafhrd and Grey Mouser in anthologies because we are going to be devoting a couple of episodes to them later. But I did read this one in here, and this is maybe my second favorite Fafhrd and Grey Mouser story. I think this is a premier example of the genre, and it perfectly illustrates Lieber's his daft sense of humor and the way he pits his two characters against each other without them becoming full-blown antagonists towards each other. So both of these two heroes, Fafhrd and Grey Mouser, Fafhrd being like a barbarian, the Grey Mouser being a thief. They are under the employ of patron wizards Ngambul of the Seven Eyes and Shilba of the Eyeless Face. And these two patron wizards, they send Fafhrd and Grey Mouser into this bazaar, this store, that the bazaar is run by a group of alien demon beings called the Devourers, who they set up shops all around the land to trick people into buying trash and garbage, luring them into their stores to devour and capture them. And then the Grey Mouser, he gets conned by the Devourers and is almost captured. Fafhrd, he receives the gifts from his patron wizard, the blindfold of true seeing and the cloak of invisibility. Hello, Dungeons and Dragons there. So he's able to go in and fight the Devourers and rescue the Grey Mouser. Just a fantastic story, full of just high adventure and a lot of fun. My least favorite story in here was The Hungry Hyrcanian, and it was actually written by L. Sprague de Camp, 1953. It's just not a good story in any way. It's poorly written, it's confusing, it's convoluted. The whole thing is like this sad story of a slave girl who gets bought, sold, stolen, raped, traded, bought, sold. It goes nowhere, and it's not adventurous, it's not exciting, and it's not a very good story. And then one story I did have a problem with here is Shadows of Zambula from Robert E. Howard, 1935. I don't think that Howard was a malicious racist. He definitely had some racist tendencies, some things he was dealing with, some demons, that is for sure. But in this story, it's basically about Conan killing a bunch of black people. They happen to be cannibals, but I feel like Howard mentions the fact that they're black more times than he mentions the fact that they're cannibals. At one point, Conan rescues a woman who says that these cannibals were lying in wait beneath a dark arch. Black men, like great hulking apes. Oof. Yeah, the story just has not aged well, and it was hard for me to read because of some of the racial qualities that Howard used to describe the antagonists. But we're going to see later, when we get into the Solomon Kane stories, which I actually like Solomon Kane more than Conan. Howard can write well-written and good black characters. So we will leave that for another time. And finally, we are to my favorite of the three, and that is Warlocks and Warriors. I like it so much that I have ended up replacing my barely holding together mass market paperback with a beautiful first edition hardback from Berkeley Putnam. It almost looks like this thing has never been read before. I was very happy I got this at the price I did. And it's one of my prize books in my collection now. This has a beautiful wraparound cover by Jim Steranko. We will definitely be seeing more Jim Steranko art later, but I really do like this wraparound cover. It is quite nice. And this collection is just fantastic. Story for story, it has so many great entries in here. And the first one, I just want to highlight something briefly, and that was by, well, let's take a look at the stories here real quick. So we have Turatal by Ray Capella, The Gods of Neon Parma by Lynn Carter, The Hills of the Dead, Robert E. Howard. That is a Solomon Kane story that I like a lot. Thunder in the Dawn by Henry Kuttner. Thieves' House by Fritz Lieber. Black God's Kiss by C.L. Moore. I did skip both of those two stories because we are going to visit them later. Chubu and Sheemish by Lord Dunsany. The Master of the Crabs by Clark Ashton Smith, The Valley of Spiders by H.G. Wells, and The Bells of Shordan by Roger Zelazny. So this first story, Turatal by Ray Capella, really interesting. It's basically a work of fan fiction that was published in a fanzine called Amra, which was all about a fanzine all about Conan. I think it was taken from, I think Amra was like a name that Conan took at one point or something like that. But this was a fanzine that also had articles and stories contributed by professional authors like Lynn Carter, which Lynn Carter's story in here was also published in Amra. But as a work of fan fiction, this is a fantastic story, and it is definitely a work of Vietnam allegory, written in 1965. I mean, if you strip away the fantasy elements, it's about a group of soldiers in a boat going up a river, infiltrating this palace that is part of the natives, these like pygmies who are employing guerrilla warfare tactics. So to say that that was a story of pure entertainment, I just can't buy it, because I really do feel like that was a story of the Vietnam era. But let's move on to my 3 favorite stories in this collection. The first is The Gods of Neon Parma from Lynn Carter, 1966. Again, another story that appeared in the pages of the Amra fanzine. And this is just a wonderfully written, beautifully, a joyous story. This story is so like light-hearted and just it's almost like a feel-good story. It's heartfelt, and it's a welcome relief from like the violence and grit found in so many of these stories. It is definitely a work of Danzani pastiche, written in the style of the Gods of Pagana. So the Gods of Neon Parma, this tells the story of this alabaster city, and Carter uses that word alabaster like 24 times in this story. But the inhabitants of the city have displeased the gods, and so the gods send one of their own as a spy, the god of fishermen, to investigate and report back with his findings. But the god spy, he ends up falling like madly in love with the city, his new normal mortal life, and its inhabitants. And so he decides to abandon his divinity and live in this city with the mortals. Super, super cool story. I absolutely loved it. Lynn Carter can be kind of hit or miss as far as his prose and his style goes, but when he hits, I think he is very good, and that story kind of proves it there. Excuse me, I want to put this cover back on just so you guys have something a little bit more interesting to look at than something bright red there. All right, so my second favorite story in this collection was, let me find it in my notes here, and that was The Bales of Shordan by Roger Zelazny, 1966. So I am a little familiar with Zelazny. I've read the Amber series, I've read Lord of Light, and a few other short stories. I don't think I ever knew he wrote in such a typical sword and sorcery fashion, and this story, The Bales of Shordan, completely blew my mind. And it was my introduction to his character, Dilvish the Damned. And this character in his story arc has escaped from like 200 years of torture in hell. And his whole quest is to get revenge on the evil warlock who sent him to hell. And what an awesome story. It's the closest thing I've read to something like Elric, in that it is just bizarre. Dilvish the Damned, he rides this black metal horse named Black, and Black's hooves create huge sparks of electricity and lightning as he gallops across the land. And in this story, he needs to go to this this city of the damned, the city of the dead, Shordan, to ring the bells of Shordan, to call forth a cursed legion who will follow Dilvish, who is a half-man, half-elf, back to a city to enact revenge. And just a wonderfully written story, full of so much evocative imagery. Super well written. I do have now in my possession the 2 Dilvish books, and we're definitely going to be spending some more time on that character. And my number 1 favorite story in here, we're going to return to Henry Kuttner, and that is 1938's The Thunder in the Dawn. What a great story. The longest story by far in all 3 of these anthologies, practically a novella. I think it's over 70 pages. And this was my introduction to Kuttner's character Elric of Atlantis. So this story takes place in the Atlantean era, which is like a pre-Conan era. And in this story, we join Elric and his rogue drunken companion Lycon, Valia, Elric's lover, and this druid named Delan. And together, this band of adventurers, they travel to the northern regions of the Atlantean lands to rescue Elric's brother and do battle with an evil warlock named Elf and the giant Vikings of the north. And just this story is just page for page, is packed with so much action, so much adventure, great banter between the characters, lots of magic and fighting and action. Just an absolutely fantastic story. I am so glad that I have been introduced to Kuttner's sword and sorcery fiction, and I cannot wait to read more. I have since purchased all of the Elric stuff, so I will be focusing on that character in the future. So these 3 anthologies, that was it. That's a long review. I rank them thusly: Warlocks and Warriors, The Spell of 7, and Swords and Sorcery. If I were to rank them by cover art, I would rank them The Spell of 7, Warlocks and Warriors, and Swords and Sorcery. You really can't go wrong with any of these. These are great introductions to the genre. They can serve as very strong launching points to discover new stories and new characters and new authors for people who are just getting into sword and sorcery as complete novices. And even me coming into it, knowing a little bit, I am still super grateful I read these, because I made some great discoveries, revisited some all-time favorites, and just had a really good time. So, all right, guys, well, I hope you enjoyed this long review. Next up, after spending so much time with so many male authors and so much testosterone in these characters, I am purposefully moving on to a female author, and we are going to be taking a look at Tanith Lee's The Birthgrave. So stay tuned for that, and we will talk to you later. Bye-bye. Hey everybody, welcome back to the Dungeon Dive. Daniel here, and welcome back to the Sword and Sorcery Saga series. And today we're going to be taking a look at a work of Sword and Planet, and that is Henry Kuttner's The Dark World. Now, Sword and Planet, as I mentioned in my introduction to this series, is kind of Sword and Sorcery's older brother, you could say. Probably started with Edgar Rice Burroughs' Mars books. Maybe there are earlier examples that I'm not aware of or will discover. But these are usually stories in which a man from Earth, from our world, is transported, spirited away, teleported into a fantastical world. And this is a kind of a premier example of Sword and Planet. And this is a pretty interesting book. It was originally published in 1946. And here you can see this old Ace paperback version. This is my collector's, my version I keep on the shelf. This is in really poor condition. The pages, the binding is almost completely broken. The pages are falling out. I probably need to invest in a better version of this book here. But the original synopsis is: it started when Edward Bond was visited in the night by a giant wolf and a shadowy hooded figure, and felt the compelling call of the need fire, or perhaps the real start had been eons before, for Bond was thrust into a strange other world, which had branched off from his own Earth thousands of years ago, a world where an ages-long battle of science and sorcery still raged, and where Bond himself was in some mysterious way the focus of powers and forces beyond his imagining. Writing in the New York Herald Tribune,
Anthony Boucher, another author, considered Harry Kuttner to be among the most imaginative, technically skilled, and literarily adroit science fantasy writers. So a work of science fantasy. That is kind of another way that Sword and Planet stories are sometimes defined. This is my reading copy here, and this is from the Planet Stories series, which was a offshoot of Paizo Publishing, and they reissued a whole bunch of great old pulp Sword and Planet and Sword and Sorcery and fantasy and science fiction stories into this Planet Stories imprint. And this version has an introduction by Pierce Anthony. One thing you can tell right off the bat is just how much better the old cover is. This cover is really, really bad, and just not quite sure what Planet Stories was thinking. They obviously didn't put a lot of thought into their covers. This old cover is just much more evocative and powerful and mysterious. But let's see what the back of this newer version says. Edward Bond is not alone in his mind. Haunted by strange events during the war, he returns home to discover he now shares his body with an identical twin from an alternate dimension, the evil wizard Ganelon. Sucked through a portal to the dark world, Bond finds himself trapped between two warring factions. On one side is the Coven. Coven. If you guys have seen American movie, you realize why I sometimes call that Coven. Pretty funny. A werewolf, an immortal, and a beautiful witch eager to acknowledge Ganelon as their sinister ruler. On the other side is the white sorceress Phyllis and her band of forest rebels that want nothing more than to see the Warlock's head on a spike. Will Edward Ganelon join with the rebels to release the oppressed world from the grip of a tyrannical, sacrifice-hungry god, or embrace the Coven to become the world's greatest villain? So yeah, it's a pretty interesting work. So you do have, it takes place after World War II. You have this character named Edward Bond, who was a pilot in World War II, and he crash landed on this island, I believe, towards the end of the war, and he gets prophesied over that he's some chosen one, and he is goes back to his home, and then he notices this fire, and he gets whisked away through the fire into this dark world where he learns that he is actually this evil sorcerer, this evil warlock named Ganelon. And Edward Bond, the good version of himself, is whisked away to Earth, and they have traded places. And the most, about 90% of this book, our point of view protagonist is actually Ganelon, the evil one, the bad guy. And so that right there kind of makes this a little more interesting, or a little different than a lot of heroic fiction. The book is not told from the point of view of the good hero. Kind of places this more into the work of maybe Vance's Dying Earth series. A lot of those stories seem to be from the point of view of an antagonist, of a bad guy. But he gets teleported to this world. He finds out that he is the ruler of this coven, this group of wizards, of sorcerers, of vampires, of werewolves, and he is the antagonist of this forest-dwelling people. Now, what's interesting is, like, the forest-dwelling people, the rebels as they are not, it's not a typical forest-dwelling community where they are one with nature and they fight with, like, wood and swords and spears. No, the forest dwellers in this, they are actually armed with, like, machine guns and grenades, and they are fighting against the more of like the supernatural entities. But what we learn is that it actually is a war of science versus superstition, because what we learn throughout the book is that the sorcerers, the werewolves, the vampires, the magic of the world really isn't magic. What they are biological mutations. And Ganelon, the evil sorcerer, retains some of the memories of his earthbound twin, what was his name? Edward Bond. and he learns to contextualize the magic, the symbology, the symbolism, the superstition of the world through a lens of science, and starts to see that these acts of magic are really not acts of magic, but are indeed acts of science. And so you have this conflict that erupts in the world between science and superstition, and that is another kind of trope of Sword and Planet stories, where you usually end up with these battles between science and superstition. So that is kind of an interesting take, and I think it does seem to be the focus of Dark World. And there is a monologue from this old being here that starts on page 110 of this. That is quite interesting, I think, and it kind of puts the book, you kind of learn about, I think, what the main theme, the main thrust of the narrative is here. I'm not going to read it because it does kind of give away quite a bit of what is going on in the book, but I thought it was pretty interesting, and is by far the most interesting thing about the book. The book itself, I don't think it's one of my favorite from Kuttner. I like his Elric stuff better. His Elric of Atlantis. We talked a little bit about some of those stories in my last Sword and Sorcery video, and I do prefer those stories. This there's not a lot of momentum in this story. Ganelon, he gets teleported from Earth to the Dark World, and then he just he doesn't go very many places. And I like fantasy where there is a lot of travel, where we get a quest, where we get a lot of movement. And in this book, they kind of seem to just kind of stay relatively in close proximity to one geographical location. And we don't get a real sense of the world, of the way it's laid out. It's more concerned with kind of this political structure political conflict between the two warring factions, and how Ganelon is betrayed by one, joins with the other in the hopes of betraying them, to pit the two against each other and to become the ultimate ruler of the Dark World. But there are double crosses and triple crosses, and things don't end up going exactly to Ganelon's plan. And the end has a nice little twist, and I think it wraps up nicely. I was just hoping for a little bit more. I think it is pretty well written. There are, of course, a lot of exclamation points, like pages of where it seems like every other sentence ends in an exclamation point. And it's funny, Piers Anthony actually talks a little bit about that in his introduction, how there are a ton of exclamation points in the book. But that, of course, was a style of the pulps to really punctuate their sentences with a lot of exclamation points. So just know that going into it, that it is a lot of people boasting and bragging and shouting and being boastful and just being boisterous. That is a trope of Sword and Sorcery and Sword and Planet. But overall, I do think it's worth checking out. It's pretty short. It's 130 pages in this version. One other complaint I have is there are a lot of named characters in that 130 pages. It seems like there's like a dozen or so named characters, and hardly any of them really have any great sense of character development. I feel like a few of them could have been combined into one way more interesting character, and it is kind of hard by the end of the book trying to keep track of who's who, just because you don't really get any real sense of development of who these characters actually are, besides what faction they belong to. So I think it would have been better if they had just had maybe half as many named characters. It would have been a little easier to keep track of. And it does, if you stop and really think about how the main character, Edward Bond and Ganelon, are connected, it kind of starts to fall apart. So it's better if you don't really think about
like how this is actually working or the intricacies of that relationship, and you just kind of suspend your disbelief and go along with the fantastical story at hand, I think you will fare much better in your opinion of the book. But I'm really glad to have read it. I think it is an interesting entry into the Sword Planet. It's short, it's not part of a series, and so you get I think a pretty satisfactory read that you can read in just a couple days, and you get a good conclusion to the story. I just wish it was developed a little more, and I wish there was just a little more exploration of the dark world itself, because I think that is the most fascinating part about the book. This war between science and superstition, and how like the monsters like vampires and werewolves, they're not actually these mythological beings. They are mutants. They are biological anomalies, mutations. So that is, I think, the most interesting part of the book, but unfortunately it's also a part of the book that isn't explored as deeply as I would like. So, all right, guys, well, I hope you enjoyed this latest entry into the Sword and Sorcery Saga series, and we will be back with more. So have a good one. Talk to you later. Bye-bye. Hey everybody, welcome back to the Dungeon Dive, and welcome back to another episode in the Sword and Sorcery Saga series. I really should have picked a name for this series with fewer S's in it. But anyways, we are going way back in time now to a work of proto sword and sorcery, and that is Abraham Merritt's The Ship of Ishtar, originally published in 1924. So as longtime viewers of the Dungeon Dive know, Abraham Merritt is one of my favorite authors. Maybe top 5 authors of all time. He is probably my favorite pulp author. I absolutely love almost everything I've read from him. Now, this is the first time that I have read The Ship of Ishtar. And that is kind of weird because this is often cited as his best, or at least his most popular. Many copies of this book were sold. We'll get a little bit more into Merritt as the series goes on, and I will probably do an episode on him because I'm planning on reading a biography on Merritt. But he was an insanely popular author when he was living. A lot of these pulp authors were not very popular with like big mass market sales while they were living, but Merritt was, and this book was a very good selling book. So this is the first time I've read it, and to be honest with you, it is not among my favorites that I've read from Merritt. It is probably actually the least favorite thing that I have read from him. There are still some good pieces to it. There are some good aspects, but overall I think it has a really hard time maintaining momentum. There are a lot of like little stops. It gets going for a little bit and then it stops. It starts, it gets going for a little bit and then it stops. There's like these little vignettes, little kinds of things that happen, but it's not a very good novel in the sense that it doesn't feel like it progresses very it doesn't feel like it doesn't build momentum in a way that I would expect, even from a collection of interconnected stories like an Elric novel would. Those kind of feel like they have a linear momentum that is building throughout each collection. And this book just kind of, it never really gets going in a way that I want it to. I also have a little bit of problem with the main character. But now let's take a look at this book. So this is the Avon edition. So let's see what this particular Avon edition has to say. The Ship of Ishtar. The American adventurer was pitched out of his own time and into a weird world of incredible and enticing marvels. So this is kind of almost kind of a work of Sword and Planet. You have a man named Kenton. He's like an explorer, an archaeologist from our world. And he discovers this block of stone, and he chisels away this block of stone, and encased in this stone is a model of this ship. And on the ship are these little miniatures, and almost like it's like he's looking at a toy. He's discovered this ancient toy. He calls the little miniatures mannequins. And he notices that at certain times, like the mannequins will actually change position, like it's moving somehow. And without him knowing why or how to trigger it, he finds himself teleported onto the deck of this ship in this very kind of typical sword and sorcery world. The reason why I don't think it's exactly Sword and Planet is because he's not teleported really to another world. He's not teleported to Mars or to Venus. There isn't really any kind of space or science fiction aspect to this book. He is very much teleported into a world of sword and sorcery. And without him he's not able to control this teleportation. So in the most, usually in opportune moments, or sometimes he's whisked away while he's being captured, there are times throughout the book where he is teleported to the ship and then also teleported back to our world, his world on Earth. And he can't quite figure out why this is happening. But the more time he spends on his ship, the more time his modernity, his modern man, his sensibilities, his modern sensibilities, his education, the more of that kind of thing is kind of stripped away, and he becomes more brute-like, almost more barbarian-like. And in that sense, I kind of like the way the character progresses, because he's kind of a louse. He's kind of a jerk. And he's very much into taking things that he wants without, and sometimes those things are women. And even when a woman offers herself to him, he's like, no, you will not offer, I will take. And the more and more time he spends on this ship, the more brutish he becomes. And that is somewhat interesting, but I still don't really feel like there is much character progression. He's just not a very interesting character. Conan can be kind of brutish, but Conan is interesting because he's very good at a lot of things, and he makes interesting decisions. Elric is not brutish, but Elric is an interesting man. He's an interesting person who makes interesting decisions and has interesting powers. Kenton, the main character here, never really comes across as somebody who is interesting. I'm not interested in spending time at all with this character. And for a work of sword and sorcery at over 200 pages, it is on the longer side. But this says, a ship of love, a ship of doom. The goddess of love and beauty was adrift on an enchanted ocean in a magic world. The myriad forces of satanic evil plagued the vessel of the rare-haired, passionate goddess. Only one man, John Kenton, the American adventurer, could save Ishtar's priestess from the black magic which divided her world from ours. So by far the most interesting thing about the book is the ship of Ishtar itself. And as you can tell from this cover, the front of the ship is the light side, and this is where the goddess of love dwells. And the back of the ship is the dark side, and the ship is divided at the mast. And there's a magical force field that if you pledge yourself to the goddess of love, you cannot pass it and go to the satanic evil side, and vice versa. And so there's this really interesting kind of dichotomy on this ship where there are two warring factions on this ship that both want to kill each other, but they've both pledged loyalty to their respective sides, and so they can't get at each other. Well, when Kenton teleports to the ship, he has not devoted his life to either side yet, so he can pass through this barrier and he can do the whims of either side against each other. Unfortunately, while that is interesting, that dramatic tension, that plot device, that problem is solved at about a quarter of the way through the book. And so you very quickly lose that most interesting aspect of the book. I also feel like this is Abraham Merritt being a pulp author, of an author of adventure stories. He is very much writing in the vein of purple prose, and I think that the Ship of Ishtar is especially purple. There are sometimes dozens of exclamation points on a single page. Sometimes it is very poetically written, like Merritt is, like he's known for. He is a fantastic prose stylist, but I had some pretty difficult times while I was reading this, keeping track of what was going on, even though the plot is relatively simple. Now, one character I did really like is Sigurd. Sigurd is this Viking that is a slave on the ship that Kenton rescues, and they become partners. And Sigurd is a very cool character. I like him a lot. I like his backstory. And he is the one who I wanted to root for. I would have much rather had him be the main character rather than Kenton. I find him more interesting. But as the story goes, Kenton takes control of the ship. He falls in love with the priestess of Ishtar. The priestess gets captured. He has to rescue the priestess. He fights these like necromancers and evil sorcerers and that kind of thing. Goes to different islands. But there really isn't a strong overarching narrative that gels everything together, and so it kind of feels a little meandering as things never really build momentum, and that is really the main problem with this. I don't recommend this as somebody's first Merritt. I would say that the People of the Pit, his short story collection, which my mind is blanking right now. I can't remember what that is called. I will put it in the comments. Or is a Better Beginning, or The Metal Monster, or The Face in the Abyss, and I think The Moon Pool are all better than The Ship of Ishtar. So unfortunately, I'm not coming out as a strong recommendation, but if you like Merritt, if you like old pulp adventure novels, and you've read quite a few, and maybe you're looking for a deeper cut, this might be something that interests you. I also have a couple other editions of that book. So here's one with the same cover, just slightly different design. These two are also both Avon editions. This is the oldest. I think this one is the next, and then this one, I believe that was the publication order. And then I also have this really nice edition, the Memorial Edition, with illustrations by Virgil Finlay. And Virgil Finlay is among the best fantasy artists. And this is just a really nice edition that I enjoy a lot. I wish I liked the story better. I wish they had these memorial editions of all of Merritt's work, especially if they were to include art by Virgil Finlay. I need to get a couple of Virgil Finlay's art books so I can share those on the channel, because his art is just amazing. It's so well detailed, so many great lines. It almost kind of looks like Dore's old wood carvings. But this is a really nice edition of this book. I just wish I liked the story a little bit more. But yeah, so that was Ship of Ishtar. It's pretty well written. It can be a little difficult to follow at times because of the purple prose and the way that Merritt is very ornate in his writing. It does contain some pretty cool ideas, especially with the ship itself and some things surrounding the adventure. But unfortunately, it never really builds the momentum that I am looking for in this kind of work of exciting fantasy. So, all right, guys, well, I hope you enjoyed that look of A. Merritt's The Ship of Ishtar, and we will talk to you later. Bye-bye. Hey everybody, welcome back to the Dungeon Dive. Daniel here, and welcome back to the next part in the Sword and Sorcery Saga, a series where we are looking at, reviewing, reading, discussing some great works of sword and sorcery fiction. And today we are going to take a look specifically at Warrior Witch of Hell, and that is written by Asa Drake. And Asa Drake is a pen name for an author called C. Dean Anderson. And this particular volume of Warrior Witch of Hell was written or published in 1985 by Questar Fantasy, and it is part of a trilogy. And the books that comprise the core trilogy are Warrior Witch of Hell, Death Riders of Hell, and Werebeasts of Hell. Now, this series has recently, somewhat recently, been republished under slightly different titles under the author's original name, which is C. Dean Anderson, and it is called the Bloodsong Trilogy. You can get the Bloodsong Hell ×3 Omnibus Collection digitally on your Kindle or other ebook device. But Warrior Witch of Hell is the book that I have read and the book that we're going to focus on today. And I have not read the other two books in the trilogy yet, which is Death Riders of Hell and Werebeasts of Hell. But rest assured, I am going to, because Warrior Witch of Hell is absolutely awesome. This is the kind of book I want to read when I am reading, just kind of spog standard sword and sorcery fiction. It is metal as F. Every chapter in this book contains at least one image that could be a heavy metal album cover. It is full of action and traps and monsters and sorcery and questing. Just a really great book that is actually surprisingly well written. It does contain some problems and some of the issues we will talk about, but overall I immensely enjoyed the hell out of Warrior Witch of Hell. Let's first talk about the covers a little bit. So all three of these original covers were of course done by Boris Vallejo, one of the big names in fantasy art. And while I do think the images themselves are pretty fantastic, they are a poor representation of the actual characters in the book. Boris Vallejo and his wife Julie Bell, of course, known for their very kind of sexual and sexualized art and their depiction of the ultimate human form. I love their work a lot. But the main character is named Bloodsong, and nowhere in the book does she ever wear anything close to what you are seeing here. She is never once sexualized at all in the book. I don't think her appearance is ever even mentioned, except for the fact that she is clad from head to toe in black. She is like a Black Death rider on this skeletal horse, this hell horse. So even the horse is kind of wrong here. But this image is taken somewhat from a depiction in the book, but just a really poor representation. I would imagine that this outfit here is probably closer to what she was wearing, but even that, she should have like a black hood on. And the depictions of her, the only depictions of Bloodsong, the main character in the novel, often has her with this ghostly mask of a skeleton, like kind of superimposed over her face, which that could have been a really awesome image in and of itself. But of course, it's Vallejo, so you got to have some sexy women there. But that's just a little bit about the art, and the art is super important. The art is what attracted me to these books, of course. I mean, these just look like any kind of power metal album cover you could think of. But let's talk about Warrior Witch of Hell. Let's read a little bit here. Bloodsong and freedom. That is a battle cry that the main characters often call out. And it says that the evil wizard Nidhugg rules, but a cry of rebellion is still remembered. The cry of Bloodsong, the woman warrior who once fought her way to freedom. Here is the dream of thousands doomed to slavery and unspeakable torture in the deathless lord's terrible fortress. Now her cry is heard again, as Bloodsong returns, riding a hell horse from the grim halls of death itself. She wields such magic as few mortals possess. On her hand is the skull ring of the death goddess Hell. At her side are a few good friends, faithful and daring, companions willing to follow Bloodsong into the very bowels of the evil stronghold. capture the powerful war scroll of hell, and destroy Nidhugg's might forever. So this book, if you wanted to think of something, maybe you're not familiar with the book, the author, it could very easily, with a couple gender swaps and name changes, be written as a He-Man novel. It's that kind of sword and sorcery. The villain Nidhugg is very much like Skeletor. He's a mustache twirling ne'er-do-well, and he's kind of, even though he has lots of power, he's also kind of bumbling in that he never really musters up enough of a force to stop the heroes. And that is one of my issues with the book, is the heroes overcome their challenges way too easily. And they're not even really depicted as Mary Sue's. They do make interesting choices, but the power level of the sorcerer, of the evil sorcerer Nidhugg, never seems to match Bloodsong and her heroes. Of course, Bloodsong is working as an agent of hell, so she has a goddess's power behind her. But I still would have liked to have seen the heroes struggle a little bit more. There is one sub-story where a hero struggles, and we'll talk about that in a minute. But what you have here is you have a story of Bloodsong. Her original name was Freyatis. This is based on kind of a Norse mythology. And Freyatis, she was killed by this evil sorcerer. So was her husband, and her daughter was kidnapped. And she goes to Hell, where she pledges allegiance to Hel, the goddess of death. Hel kind of renames her as Bloodsong, sends her back to the world of the living with this Hel ring, and Hel has etched on Bloodsong's mind the spells and the powerful incantations that she will need to defeat Nidhugg. Where once she was a warrior who completely turned her nose up and turned her back on the power of magic, now she is a magic and sword wielding hell warrior who can summon a skeletal horse, who can shoot a fire beam out of her ring. She can summon wind demons. She is a very powerful character, not unlike Elric, who summons the power of chaos. And she is on a quest for Hel to defeat Nidhugg, the evil sorcerer, who uses the power of the War Skull and who dwells underneath the castle of Nostrand in the Cavern of the War Skull. And the War Skull is this totem, this massive stone skull that has to be recharged by human sacrifice. And so Nidhugg keeps a huge supply of slaves in which he straps to his cavern walls and kills them, drains their energy, turning them into raisin-like corpses, and drains their energy into the War Skull, where he uses the power of the War Skull to stay young and powerful. And so that is kind of the two opposing forces. And the use of sorcery and the sword of the sword and sorcery genre is it's definitely a focus in this book, because you do have Bloodsong and her not wanting to originally use magic, but she's forced to become powerful enough to overthrow the evil sorcerer. And on her quest to the castle, she meets a party of characters, and they form a party. And so you have a young witch named Huld, and she works for the goddess Freya. And Huld is a healer. She's young. She helps the party by healing them. She has a spell of night vision, so she can help them get through dark and clouded areas. And then along the way, Bloodsong is also joined by two of her older friends, a couple named Thorfinn, who is a human kind of barbarian, a Viking probably, and Velgarth, his companion, his wife, his partner. And she's really good with a bow. And Thorfinn and Velgarth, they knew Bloodsong way back in the day, before Bloodsong became Bloodsong, when she was Freyatis. And they knew her and her husband and their daughter. and they join her on her quest to kill the evil sorcerer. And what's interesting is Velgarth has this somewhat troubled relationship with Bloodsong now, because she sees in her the power of hell, and Velgarth is still very much anti-magic, and she has to struggle with her relationship with this new entity named Bloodsong, balancing her old friendship with Freyatis with her new relationship with the entity called Bloodsong. And that's ends up being a pretty interesting part of the book. The camaraderie, the banter between the party is really good. With Hold, the young witch, she kind of lies about her expertise, and that gets her into some trouble. Bloodsong gives her a lot of grief over that and kind of jabs at her and like, hey, if you're such a powerful witch, how come you couldn't see this coming? And that's really cool. And then Thorfinn and Velgarth, they're a great couple, a power couple, and I really like them in the book a lot. Now, I did say that the characters mostly overcome their situations, their troubles with ease, but there's one character in the book, and I forgot to write down the name, so I'm just gonna have to find it real quick. And she is a slave that Nordhug uses, and her name is Jalal, I think her name is. Jalna. So Jalna is a slave that Nidhugg uses to get to Bloodsong. He possesses her. He uses her power to teleport his psyche all over the world, or all over the land, so he can track Bloodsong. And he is constantly using her in very brutal ways. She gets tortured. She like almost literally goes through hell and back. And she is really put through the ringer, and she comes out victorious, mostly. And I really liked her character's dramatic arc was really good. And that was one of the most interesting things about the book. And there is a really cool twist with Nidhugg sends her down into this pit of these slave demons that he has underneath his cave of the War Skull, and he sends her down there to be brutalized by these walking corpses. But there's a really cool twist where things don't turn out quite as Nidhugg had planned. Now, there is a lot of nudity in the book, but it's never depicted in a way that is like overly sexualized or used to tantalize. It is mainly used to show how Nidhugg treats his slaves. He forces his slaves to be naked all the time. He actually forces them to fight naked in an arena and to humiliate them. And there's a really cool part where, a long time ago, Freyatis, Bloodsong, and Velgarth were slaves of Nidhugg, and they had to fight naked in this arena. And at one point, Velgarth and Thorfinn are on the run from these soldiers, and one of the soldiers recognizes Velgarth's face, and she actually comments that he must have been the only soldier in watching the battle in the arena who was focusing on her face. And I thought that was a really cool little detail. And the women characters, I think you have three really strong female leads in the core party. They are they're pretty well written. They do interesting things. They make interesting choices. You have Jalna, who is being held captive, and even though she is pretty much naked throughout the entire book, she also fights back very aggressively against Nidhugg and uses her mind and her powers to overcome the hell that she is put through. So just a fantastic book. It's full of just zombies and monsters and magic. Great sword fights, lots of blood, lots of a great central quest, something that you can read quickly. It's exciting. I had a smile on my face the entire time I was reading it. It's barely over 200 pages, and I recommend this book as much as I could recommend a book of sword and sorcery. I cannot wait to read parts 2 and 3, Death Riders of Hell and Werebeasts of Hell. If they are half as good as Warrior Witch of Hell, then this is going to be one of my favorite fantasy trilogies. It is pretty well written too. I was surprised at how well written it is. Let's just read a little bit here. This is from the prologue. In the center of a vast torchlit cavern, a dying witch hung naked in spell chains upon a monstrous skull. The towering skull pulsed with purple light, throbbing with a deep, rumbling moan. In spite of the cavern's icy air, the young woman's skin glistened with the sweat of pain and fear, her long blonde hair clinging wetly to her bare flesh. Through eyes half closed with pain and exhaustion, she gazed down at the tall man in gold-trimmed purple robes standing below her on the cavern floor, his face concealed beneath a black silk hood, while black leather gloves covered his hands. A stench of death emanated from him, wafting up to her through the frigid air. He was Nidhugg, sorcerer, warrior king, and traitor to the death goddess Hel. So yeah, that's a nice prologue. It gets you right into like what is going on in this book really well, and the writing stays consistent throughout. It's not overly purple, it's not tons of exclamation points and $10 words, but it's also not just simply written in like kind of a juvenile way. I think the writing is actually pretty dang good. So yeah, Warrior Witch of Hel, the Blood Song Trilogy by Asa Drake. Highly recommended, and we will definitely be discussing the other two books when I finish them. So, all right, guys, well, I hope you enjoyed this, and we will talk to you later. Bye-bye. Hey everybody, welcome back to the Dungeon Dive. Daniel here, and welcome back to the next installment of the Sword and Sorcery series, the Sword and Sorcery Saga series, I should say. And today we are going to be taking a look at one of the heavy hitters of the genre, and that is Karl Edward Wagner's Darkness Weaves, one of his Kane novels. Now, Wagner is kind of a cult hero amongst Sword and Sorcery fans. He tragically died much too early, I think basically due to complications of alcoholism. He was one of those lights that shone very brightly for a somewhat short period of time, kind of like Robert E. Howard, Wagner's hero. So really just a brief kind of overview on Wagner. He was also an editor and a publisher. He edited quite a few of the year's best horror stories from Daw, and this one with a really great cover from Michael Whalen there. He was also a writer of straight horror fiction, and this is one of two, I believe, short story collections he had published while he was living. And that is Why Not You and I. This collection here has 4 new stories in it, and this was edited by Charles L. Grant and also includes stories by one of my favorites, David Morrell, the original creator of Rambo and writer of First Blood. He also wrote at least one Conan novel that I know of. There might be others, but I haven't taken a look. But this is the one that I have here, The Road of Kings. And he did edit a few Conan books, kind of the like definitive trilogy here of some Conan stories that he edited. He went back and found Howard's like original words and made these definitive versions of these stories of the People of the Black Circle, Red Nails, and the Hour of the Dragon. In addition to also writing the Kane stuff, which is he is probably most famous for is his Kane stuff and his editing of the Conan, the Robert E. Howard Conan stories. And we have Night Winds, we have Dark Crusade, Bloodstone, and Death Angel's Shadow. So the Kane books, some are novels, some are short story collections. The one we are going to be taking a look at today is Darkness Weaves. And this says, these covers are all, of course, done by Frank Frazetta. And we have Cain leads the avenging forces of a sorceress linked with the devils of the deep. So Cain, the mystic swordsman, commands the fleet of an island empress, a ravaged ruler bent on bitter revenge. Once Ephraim was the beautiful consort of a king. Now she is a hideous creature who lives only for revenge. She has allies to aid her, but only Cain, the mystic swordsman, can rally her forces for battle. Only he can deliver the vengeance she has devised in her own knowledge of black magic and her power to unleash the demons of the deep. Another Cain adventure. And this here has a quote from John Jakes. Wagner has created an intriguing hero, part savage, part savant, with a dash of satanic seasoning. So Cain is a pretty interesting character. He is probably the biblical Cain. He might be immortal. He can definitely be killed, but I don't think he can't die of like natural causes. He's been around for hundreds of years, millennia. There is a really cool chapter in here in which Ephraim, the evil sorceress who hires Cain to enact her plot of revenge, there's a really interesting chapter here, probably my favorite chapter in this book, where through a demonic summoning, she learns about the entire true history of Cain, the mystical swordsman, and it's really cool. We get to see Cain through the ages, and I really liked that. So this was originally published in 1978. It is definitely, I would not say it is a Conan pastiche or a Howard pastiche, but it is in that same vein as Conan. I think with a little bit of kind of a, maybe a little bit of Fafhrd and Grey Mouser. So if you are familiar with those three characters, you would be familiar with Cain. Now, unfortunately, a lot of Wagner stuff is completely out of print and super hard to find. You can get the Cain novels on ebook on Kindle, and so that is probably the way that I would recommend you checking them out to find out if you like them before you start collecting the books, because they can be quite expensive. I think each of these mass markets now goes for probably between $20 and $40 if you can find them. But there is a real an error of confidence in Wagner's writing. He wasn't a super stylistic writer. I wouldn't say he didn't practice in like purple prose or his overly ornate a style. Very direct, very succinct, but also full of confidence. You can tell that he was a practiced writer and an editor, and he knew what to show, what to tell, and when to do it, and what to leave out for the most part. There are a few chapters in Darkness Weaves that I feel could have been edited down, possibly maybe even left out altogether, and that is probably my biggest fault with Darkness Weaves, is I think it is a little too long for the story being told. This would have been a really good book if it was maybe about half the length. It would have been a fantastic book. And then maybe coupled with another novella. As a almost 300-page novel, there are parts where I felt like skimming, and that's too bad because the good parts are really quite good. And what's really funny is while I was reading this, and I texted my buddy Aaron while I was reading this, and I was like, I'm reading Darkness Weaves now, and I keep getting little hints of James Bond. If you guys have read this or you're going to read it, think of James Bond while you are reading it and see if you pick up on those cues as well. It's just, it kind of follows similar beats to a James Bond novel or movie. It picks up kind of like with an action sequence. Then you get a little bit of intrigue. You get some travel to a central destination where a lot of the novel takes place. Like if this was a Bond novel, it would have been taking place like in a casino or a villa or a chateau or something. In this case, it's this very old and cryptic castle. And then there's even a scene where Cain goes night diving to look for a clue. And to me, that was like just straight out of a James Bond novel. So I thought that was really funny that I kept thinking of James Bond while I was reading this. But Cain is not so much of a character is he is a force of nature, a force of violence. He is a tool that gets used by this sorceress Ephraim in this book. It's not until the very end of the book where Cain really starts to kind of take control. And so for a long time, Cain is just kind of doing what he is told in this novel. But in the back of his mind, we know that he is ready to strike when the iron is hot and when he needs to. And also at the end, towards the end of this book, there is an introduction of a third faction that feels a little forced, and it's definitely a work of Deus Ex Machina. I don't mind that so much. I mean, one of my favorite writers is Stephen King, so I can't complain too much about that. But in this book, I wish it was developed a little earlier and sprinkled throughout the book rather than just coming in towards the end. There are also a couple chapters that focus on these kind of two side characters from the opposing force that Cain and the sorceress are fighting against. And I feel like those go on for a little too long, and they're not very interesting. I want to spend time with Ephraim, the sorceress. I want to spend time with Cain, and I want to spend time with Cain's buddy, his assassin friend, Arbus. Really a cool side character. I like their interactions a lot. What I really like about this book is the way that Ephraim, the sorceress, is portrayed. Such a evil and tragic villain, just fantastic villain. She was once a very beautiful woman, but she betrayed the emperor, and the emperor tortured her, and she miraculously lived. Well, she probably wished that she had died. She was dragged through town behind a horse, completely crippled. She lost an eye, she lost skin all over her body, she lost a leg. I think she lost one hand. I mean, she is like this, basically just a living corpse hobbling along. And she is a hideous figure, and so her whole goal for the rest of her life is to get revenge on this emperor, and she hires Cain to do that as a tool, as a powerful tool, because she has been told by these demonic forces that Cain is like the only man who can do what she needs to get done. So overall, I think this is a pretty good book. This is actually the first of the Cain stories that I have read. So I've had these for quite some time, but I just have never pulled the trigger on them to read them. It was probably not the best introduction to Cain, as far as I'm concerned, because I did feel like it was just a little too long for what the story was portraying. But again, the parts that were there were really quite cool. I think Cain as a force of nature, as a power, is an interesting character. He's kind of a Mary Sue in a way. He's kind of like Elric in a way, where not only is he a great fighter, but he's a philosopher. He's well read. He knows about magic. He knows about demons. He knows about the occult. I mean, he is like just like an uber male. He knows how to do everything and do it almost perfectly. But he's also a great general. He's a great diplomat. I mean, there's nothing that Cain can't do. Cain the Immortal, the great mystical swordsman. I'm definitely looking forward to reading more. And even if I sound a little negative on Darkness Weeds, I think my expectations for this book were a little too high. And so when it didn't match this kind of like lofty ambition, lofty space in my head, then I was just a tad let down. All of the chapters with Cain, all of the chapters with Ephraim, all of the chapters focusing on their side, they're dealing with what they are planning and executing, I thought were fantastic. It was the kind of king and court, there's like a little love story and some political drama on the other side of the conflict that I just didn't really love. Also, one thing to know, there are really no good guys in Cain stories. Cain can be very evil. He is working for an evil sorceress. The emperor who tortured the sorceress is evil. I mean, they're all just like that. It's not even shades of gray. They're all like kind of like various shades of black. And so if you need a more of a heroic character, you're probably not going to find that here. There isn't really any like overtly evil things. I mean, these aren't like super evil things. You're not going to be disturbed while reading Kane, unless some of the violence, it can be pretty violent, but just know going into it that you're going to be dealing with shades of black and dark gray, you might say. But yeah, overall, I'm super happy that I finally read some Kane, and I can't wait to read more. So one thing is I usually like to pick out something to read, but the writing is just, there's nothing really stood out in here. There was never a passage that I read that I was like, oh man, that was amazing. And I usually would write it down. And so because that didn't happen in here, and I was kind of expecting it to, that might be another reason why I'm not looking on this book as fondly as some others might. So some others might be able to, maybe in the comments, point to some really good passages in here. But I'm expecting to find well-written and memorable passages in other Wagner that I read. So, all right, guys. Well, I hope you enjoyed this look at Darkness Weaves, the first novel from Kane that I have read, and that is by Karl Edward Wagner. And we will talk to you later. Bye-bye. Hey everybody, welcome back to the Dungeon Dive. Daniel here, and welcome back to the Sword and Sorcery Saga series. And today we're going to be taking a look at The Maze of Peril by John Eric Holmes. So while this is not like strictly a work of sword and sorcery fiction, it is most definitely a work of appendix in fiction. And given the kind of broad scope of this series, we are going to include it. One might make the argument that this is the most appendix in fiction. This book, more than probably any other I've ever read, feels like you are reading the exploits of a bunch of player characters sitting around the table playing a game of Dungeons and Dragons. And that really is what this is. Famously, this book and its characters were created to tell the stories that were created around the table while John Eric Holmes and his kids and friends were playing Dungeons and Dragons. And that is exactly what it reads like, warts and all. Oftentimes when we read fiction that is based on RPG games, such as like the Dragonlance, the original Dragonlance series, you don't really get that sense because the characters in the books are just too perfect. They make all of the right choices most of the time, or they make logical choices. And as those of us who play D&D a lot, we know that players hardly ever make like right choices. They hardly ever make logical choices. There's a lot of goofy choices. There's a lot of poor decisions made. There's a lot of just kind of like goofing off at the table, and this book captures that feeling perfectly. Another thing that this book is a perfect example of is a book that, while not particularly well written, it is pretty entertaining. I would say that this is one of the most just kind of like purely entertaining fantasy novellas I've ever read. It's not great. There are definitely some issues with it. There's some weird pacing. Even though it's short, it does feel a little long. There are some weird things that I would say that the main problem is its pacing and its actual writing. The prose just isn't very good. So for those of you who are familiar with John Eric Holmes, he needs no introduction. But for those of you who aren't, maybe a brief introduction is needed. If you aren't familiar with him, I bet you are in a roundabout way. So he was kind of an instrumental part of early D&D development. He worked as some kind of editor on Dungeons and Dragons. He was he was seen as the editor slash compiler, creator, modifier of the D&D Basics set from 1977. He wrote for Dragon Magazine. He wrote in like the Greyhawk and the Blackmoor settings. And he also, according to Wikipedia, created the Wereshark character, which the Wereshark monster, which the Wereshark is a prominent monster in this book here. So he has been kind of tangentially involved in the D&D hobby for pretty much like his entire life. And he has a series of stories that he has written, and this is, I think, a collection of a couple of them, or maybe this was written as a novel. But he have Zareth, the Dark Elf, and Wagner, the Halfling Fighter, which is kind of a weird combination, and Murray the Mage. Now, Murray the Mage in this book is actually he calls himself a second level wizard. So there's a lot of weird kind of like gaming meta things or anachronisms in this book. There's another character named Sir Geoffrey. He is a knight who speaks in really poorly written Old English, which is odd. You can definitely tell that was like a character, a player who thought that would be cool to speak like I don't know, I can't do Old English, but you know, ye and thous and stuff, it's pretty funny. And then there's Brother Ambrose, who is like a very blatant Christian cleric. I never really imagined Christians being clerics, but I guess that makes sense given the background of Gary Gygax. You know, he was Catholic. But yeah, the cleric in here is like a Christian priest, basically. And then you also have an Amazon warrior woman who rides a unicorn. You can tell that these characters were created by players. But let's read the back of this book here. What race or races built the maze no one knew? In the opinion of the sages of Caladan, many layers of dungeons and underworld were laid down, one on top the other, as the world crust was formed, so that now no one knew or even guessed how many levels extended below the surface. Corridors of wealth, there were also tunnels of deadly peril, for many of the rash adventurers and soldiers of fortune who set forth for the secret entrances were never heard from again. To those with the courage and ability to survive the challenges, however, the maze had always paid equal tribute with its fabulous mysteries and treasures from countless civilizations. Now the Dragonites, creatures part human, part frog, maybe they should be called like the Frogonites or something, seek to keep these riches for themselves and extend their domain to the surface. It falls to Wagner, the halfling and his companions, in the midst of their quest for personal glory and wealth, to discover the Dragonite stronghold, challenge their warriors and wizards, rescue a kidnapped friend, preserve the waterways of Amazonia, and perhaps save the world. Okay, super fun sounding. And based on that, and based on like the first 50 pages, you would think this was kind of like a mega labyrinth, a mega maze, a mega dungeon type adventure. But at least half of it also takes place in a city setting. It's an urban adventure mixed with a dungeon crawl. And to tell you the truth, I think the book really shines during those urban moments. So the beginning of the book, it starts off with a group of characters, an adventuring party led by Wagner and Zareth, and they go into the dungeon, and everything goes wrong. They have a terrible time. It's a tragedy. It's a complete disaster. And so they escape back to the city to regroup and kind of reform their party. And then they get involved in kind of these weird, almost Fafhrd and Grey Mouser-like thieving exploits in the city. And there are 2 chapters about this bungled burglary that are incredibly entertaining. Some of my favorite like urban fantasy that I've read, and by urban fantasy I mean urban adventure in a D&D setting, not Neil Gaiman style urban fantasy. But Zareth and Wagner, they have to infiltrate this mage's tower to steal this crystal ball so that Murray the Mage can utilize its powers. And they end up just completely botching the robbery. They use a basilisk as a like a biological weapon, and they accidentally turn a flesh golem into a stone golem, and the stone golem chases them around, wreaking havoc around the city. And it is really, really entertaining, incredibly fun, funny, and just kind of exuberant. It has this real sense of childlike adventure and joy during those chapters. And I wish the rest of the book was that good. There are still things that are good about it, but those two chapters really stick out and just really shine. And the rest is just a little bit dull in comparison. When they go back into the maze of Peril, they kind of end up discovering there is this somewhat Lovecraftian god, kind of like Dagon. It might actually be, they might actually name check Dagon here, but it's definitely kind of like a Deep One's elder god who is controlling things. And but the adventure ends with them, or it climaxes with them inside the dungeon. So I really like the middle part in the town. I thought was fantastic. The two bookending dungeon parts of those two, I liked the first one the best. The third one just kind of, or the last part just kind of starts to feel a little long in the tooth for what the book has to offer. But overall, I greatly enjoyed my time spent with The Maze of Peril by John Eric Holmes. When was this published? So it's kind of a weird publishing date, because I think these are probably kinds of stories that were probably in Dragon magazine and then later collected. Copyright 1986 by John Eric Holmes. But yeah, if you're looking for something that it really reads definitively reads like a Dungeons and Dragons module, like a novel written with participation from player characters sitting around the table, then you're really going to want to check out The Maze of Peril. If you prefer your fantasy with a bit more of a more serious edge, or something maybe a little darker, or maybe just a little more less having that player agency from around the table interjected in into the story, then you might want to avoid The Maze of Peril. Personally, I had a really good time with it, and I'm going to try to find some other things that John Eric Holmes has written. Unfortunately, a lot of his stuff seems to be somewhat hard to find these days. So yeah, but that's it. Just wanted to do a quick review of The Maze of Peril for the Sword and Sorcery Saga series. I hope you guys enjoyed it, and we'll talk to you later. Bye-bye. Hey everybody, welcome back to the Dungeon Dive. Daniel here. Okay, and welcome back to the Sword and Sorcery Saga, our continuing deep dive and review series all about sword and sorcery, sword and planet, and appendix and fiction. And in this episode, we're going to do a quick review of Dilvish the Damned by Roger Zelazny. So if you guys remember, all the way back in March of this year, March of 2021, when we officially kicked off the Sword and Sorcery Saga series, we did a review of 3 anthologies, and one of those anthologies we looked at was the absolutely incredible Warlocks and Warriors, edited by L. Sprague de Camp. And in this story, or in this collection, I was introduced to Dilvish the Damned, Zelazny's character, with the Bells of Shordan. And that was the very first time I had ever read a Dilvish the Damned story, and I absolutely fell in love. And so I wanted to end this year's Sword and Sorcery coverage with the last video for the year in this series, with actually looking at the first book of Dilvish the Damned. So there are 2 books. Dilvish the Damned is the first, and this is a collection of the original short stories. And then we have here The Changing Land, which is a novel which concludes the main quest from this book. At least I think it does. I have not read The Changing Land yet, but I'm going to early in 2022. So I can say right off the bat that both of these books, well, let's just say for sure, this book, Dilvish the Damned, it deserves a better cover. This book is incredible. I absolutely love it. I think it is up there for me with the Elric Saga, and I'll talk a little bit about why that is. The Elric Saga is, so far, personally, my favorite work of sword and sorcery fiction. And then The Changing Land, I don't know if the book deserves this kind of not so great cover, or maybe it does, but we will return to this book in the beginning parts of 2022 to finish Dilvish's quest. But Dilvish the Damned, this original book, let's read what it says here on the back. The road from hell. Escaping from hell was only the beginning for Dilvish, and Black, his demonic metal horse, finding Elric, the evil sorcerer who sent him to 200 years of torture, was the only thing that interested him, but fate had other plans. The armies of Colonel Lilish attacked his homeland, and only Black could carry Dilvish through the enemy lines to warn the king. The city of Dilfar was under siege, and only Dilvish, descendant of Selar, could raise the ghostly legions of Shordan and bring them to its aid. Then a damsel in distress cried out for help, but really wanted his blood. Twin sorcerers needed him as a pawn in a deadly game of power. An ancient forgotten goddess tried and failed to stop his quest for vengeance, while a werewolf almost succeeded. Then, when Dilvish finally climbed to Elric's stronghold in the Tower of Ice, he found nothing but greater perils separating him from his ancient enemy. Really kind of an awkward back of the book, I think, an awkward synopsis. And I think it does the book quite a bit of disservice to try to sell it as a novel with one cohesive narrative, because it is definitely not. And if you go into this book thinking that it is a novel with a cohesive through line of narration, I think you're going to be disappointed. This is most definitely a collection of scattered short stories, somewhat in a chronological order. I'm sure the chronological order was established later by Zelazny, not at the time of writing the stories, but at the time of putting together this collection. And there are actually a lot of loose ends. The main quest to get revenge on Elric is completely forgotten for most of the book. It is mentioned a couple times. You think maybe once it appears in one of the stories, right kind of the middle of the collection, you might think that the remaining stories are going to be about that, but they're not. That's not to say that they're not good, because they really are. But if you decide to pick up this book, just know that you're just going to be reading a collection of short stories. Now, that was also similar with Elric. Elric was originally published like in serialized short story fiction, and later Moorcock would go in and he would kind of write little connecting shorter bits and pieces, reworking his stories into chronological novels. And those work more as novels, where this most definitely does not. So this was originally published in 1982, and the different stories range from 1964, which is the passage to Dilfar, and then the last one was written in 1981. Now what's interesting is that The Changing Land, the sequel, which concludes Dilvish's quest, was actually published in 1981. So the sequel actually came out before the original. So like Elric 2, it also has kind of a weird publishing history. But the stories that are included here, we have Passage to Dilfar, Thalindi's Song, The Bells of Shordan, and Night for Meritha, The Places of Ache, A City Divided, The White Beast, Tower of Ice, Devil in the Dancer, Garden of Blood, and finally Dilvish the Damned. And the first grouping of those were all written in the 60s and published in the 60s, I should say. Then there was quite of a long break, and then he picked up the character again in 1971 and finished up this in 1981. So one of my biggest fears when I picked up this book, and just because I liked the Bells of Shordan so much, was I was afraid that maybe that was like the ultimate, like that was the best Dilvish would ever be, and everything else would be maybe diminishing returns or just not quite stack up to the just how incredible that story was. Well, I'm happy to say that not only is that not true, but it's not even my favorite story in this collection. That's how good the rest of these stories are, or I should say many of these stories are. Some of them are quite short. There's a few longer ones. As the years progress, the stories do get a little bit longer. One of my two favorite things about these stories. The first is Dilvish's relationship with his metallic demon horse Black. It is super cool. A lot of times these sword and sorcery novels, they are very much about a lone hero or a hero and a companion up against the world, and that is true about the stories here. But because his companion is this demonic horse, it can take the shape or the shape of a statue at any time to trick people into thinking it's just a statue. But it is a demonic entity that has possessed this black metal horse. And it's an interesting dynamic. I'm sure it's somewhat similar if like the Witcher's horse Roach or horses Roach could speak. You might have a similar kind of conversations between Dilvish and Black. So Dilvish is a half elf, half human warrior, kind of rogue, or like a lot of these sword and sorcery characters, heroes. He multi-classes, if you want to use gaming terms. He's a rogue ranger fighter type guy. He was imprisoned in hell by this sorcerer. By this wizard, and we don't really know why. The book begins with him already having escaped from hell. I don't know if you will ever get a flashback of him being in hell, but he has escaped like 200 years of torment. He comes back in this first story, riding towards his old city and trying to kind of reestablish his life, forget his pain and torment of hell. And as we've learned in the Bells of Shordan, he needs to go and resurrect this army of the dead to bring them back to his city in order to help defend against the the forces of one of these counts here. And so yeah, that is kind of like the background. And what we really have here, though, are a series of disconnected short stories of little adventures that he goes on while he is riding around the land. And it's kind of like that old saying, no good deed goes unpunished. And every time he kind of stops to help, usually against Black's best suggestion. Black doesn't like how much help Dilvish always wants to give to people. But Dilvish is actually a pretty good guy. We learn he treats people well when they deserve to be treated well. And he's also a very good fighter. And because he's a half elf, he does maybe have an understanding, let's say, of magic. But one of my favorite stories in the book is the Places of Ache. And the other thing that I really liked about these stories is they almost never take the path that I think they're going to take once I start reading them. They are consistently and constantly surprising. They are always offering up very inventive plot twists, and the characters, they don't act in the way that I think they're going to act. They act in a natural way that feels like they would act, but they almost never do what I think they're going to do. And that was something that I really appreciated about these stories, because so often in these stories we are so used to the tropes and just the common way that these types of sword and sorcery heroes and characters act. So to see people acting differently is really cool. So I did want to read the Places of Ache is my favorite story, and I just absolutely love the beginning. The humor in this is really quite well done. There were quite a few moments throughout these 200 and so pages that I did laugh out loud. And so I do want to read a little bit about from this story. And this says, as Dilvish the Damned traveled through the north countries, he passed one day along a twisting road through a low pine-filled valley. His great black mount seemed tireless, but there came a time when Dilvish halted to unpack rations and make a meal. His green boots soundless upon the needles, he spread his cloak and placed his fare upon it. There is someone coming. That was Black saying that. Thanks, says Dilvish. He loosened his blade and began to eat standing. Shortly, a large bearded man on a roan stallion rounded a bend and slowed. Ho, traveler, the man hailed. May I join you? You may. The man halted and dismounted. As he approached, he smiled. Rajas is the name, he stated. And yours? Dilvish. You've traveled far? Yes, from the southeast. Do you also make a pilgrimage to the shrine? What shrine? That of the goddess Ache, up yonder hill. He gestured up the hill. No, I was not even aware of its existence. What is its virtue? The goddess may absolve a man of murder. Oh, and are you making a pilgrimage for this reason? Yes, I have done it often. Do you come from afar? No, I live just up the road. It makes life a lot easier. I think I begin to get the picture. Good. If you will be so kind as to pass me your purse, you will save the goddess the work involved in an extra absolution. Come and take it, Dilvish said, and he smiled. Rajas's eyes narrowed. Not many men have said that to me, and I may well be the last. I'm bigger than you are, I've noticed. You are making things difficult. Would you be willing to show me whether you're carrying enough coin to make it worth either of our efforts? I think not. How about this then? We split the money and neither of us takes a bloody chance. No. Rajas sighed. Now the situation has grown awkward. Let me see. Are you an archer? No. No bow. No throwing spears either. It would seem that I could ride away without being shot down. To ambush me later, I'm afraid I can't permit it. It has become a matter of future self-defense. Pity, Rajas said, but I'll chance it anyway. Just great banter between the characters. Dilvish does end up killing that would-be bandit, that robber, and he rides to the shrine himself for absolution, and then things take a very bizarre turn, and one that I would have never seen coming, but the turn that it takes was so much better than anything that I could have imagined. So that is Dilvish the Damned. I highly recommend this. Just know going into it that you are not going to get a conclusion to any of the major story arcs. You're not going to get a conclusion about his bringing the army of the damned, of the dead, back to his city to defend it. You're not going to get a conclusion to his tale of revenge. But what you are going to get are a series of stories that focus on some fantastic adventures that Dilvish goes on, and meeting with all kinds of very cool and interesting characters and a lot of bizarre things. If you've read Elric, I know that Elric can get very weird. Dilvish the Damned gets almost as weird and bizarre as Elric, and that is one of the reasons why I like it so much. I am really hoping that the major plot threads, the major arc is concluded, and concluded satisfactory in the Changing Land. I am going to leave it, of course, up to Zelazny to continue to surprise me. I'm going to go into this book with absolutely no preconceived notions about what to expect, because this book here is most definitely a single novel. So it'll be interesting to see if Zelazny can carry that momentum through from the short stories into a single longer work. Sorry guys, well, I hope you liked my review and this video on Dilvish the Damned. I hope you are looking forward to 2022 and discovering and discussing all kinds of interesting sword and sorcery and appendix in fiction with me on the Dungeon Dive here. We have so many books to go over, just hundreds. I can't wait to get to my shelf-to-shelf video series, back to that when I finally get to my sword and sorcery and appendix in shelves, so I can share all of my books with you guys. So, all right, well, I hope you enjoyed this, and we will talk to you later. Bye-bye. Hey everybody, welcome back to the Dungeon Dive. Daniel here, and welcome back to the next episode in the Sword and Sorcery Saga series. And welcome to the last video of 2021. And we are going to close out the year with a look at Phyllis and Karr's Frostflower and Thorn. And next to it is the sequel, Frostflower and Windborn, but I have not read that, but I am going to, and we will probably talk about this volume in 2022. But Frostflower and Thorn is a very interesting book, one that I highly recommend, even though it does have some issues. So let's take a look here and see what the back of the book says. Swords, Woman, and Sorceress. The sorceress Frostflower could bring a babe from seed to term in the course of a winter's afternoon. The swordswoman Thorn could strew a field of corpses in a moment's battle rage. Outcasts, both of them, hunted by the farmer priests who ruled the wasteland that once had been a world. Then Thorn in her folly got pregnant. Flower in her folly wanted the child, and together, foolishly, they set out to survive. Okay, so this book was published in, I believe, 1980. It has a cover by an artist named Elric, and I do really like this cover. It is so evocative of the time in which the book was published, that kind of late 70s, early 80s, Linda Carter, Dynasty Dallas type look to the heroes there. So this book is all about a swordswoman named Thorn and a sorceress named Frostflower. And it is one of the strongest works of, I think, feminist science, or not science fiction, but sword and sorcery that I have read, and I really appreciated it for that. This is the first book by a woman author that we are taking a look at on this series. And one of the things that I appreciate most about this book is that it's not just a lazy gender swap. This isn't just a female version of Conan. And conversely, if you were to change either or both of these characters into a male character, the story would not work. There wouldn't be a plot at all. The plot is laser focused on these two characters and the decisions that they make. Nothing is taken away from the agency. The agency is never stripped away from these characters in the sense of how the plot revolves around their choices and the things that happen to them because they are women. Now, I do want to give a really quick trigger warning for this, because this book can be very brutal, especially in the instance of a rape that occurs in the book. But rest assured, the rape is not there to be tantalizing or to be sexual in any way. It is purely used as a way to show how the patriarchy keeps these women down, even though they are the very source of the power that allows the patriarchy to exist. In this book, there are layers of social and political systems that are so intertwined that it's very hard to discuss. But let's talk a little bit about what the book is about. So we have Thorn, and Thorn is an incredibly entertaining character. She's one of the surliest, just most brutal and blunt characters I've read in the genre. I loved her so much. And the book begins with her in bed with some random dude, and she wakes up because she has morning sickness and she needs to throw up. And she's super pissed that she has morning sickness. She's also super pissed that this dude is still in bed with her. And she's like, get up, get out. I'm done with you. I had my fun with you. I'm pregnant. I need to find somebody to give me an abortion. And the dude's like, well, it's not my kid. And she goes like, I know it's not your kid. I don't know whose kid this is. All of the sword-wielding mercenaries in this book are women, and they band together in mercenary groups, and they hire themselves out to these farmer priests who are like the land barons and the rulers of this world, and they use the women to protect their land and to protect their power. And of course, being a mercenary, she cannot have a kid because it would ruin her station, would ruin her life. She would no longer be able to be a mercenary. She would have to be a domesticated woman, and she does not want that.
So she's out trying to look for somebody to give her an abortion. She runs into this sorceress, Frostflower, who she wants a child. However, in the world of this book, the power of the sorcery is tied into their virginity, and that takes a major focus of this book. And she wants a child, but she cannot have one. But one of the powers that the sorcery have in this book is the ability to accelerate growth. They can take a single seed and grow it into a flowering tree or plant, a fruiting tree or flowering plant in a matter of minutes. And she convinces Thorn to allow her to ensorcel her pregnancy, and Thorn gives birth to the baby in a matter of hours. And that choice that these two women make creates a ripple effect in the systems in which they live that kicks off this plot where they are having to run from the farmer priest. They are having to deal with men trying to destroy them. They are having to deal with protecting this baby, even though Thorn doesn't really want the baby. But she becomes a friend and a protector of Frostflower. Frostflower gets just brutalized, and it's quite sad the things that happen to Frostflower, but she comes out of it, I'm not going to say a stronger woman, because I'm not going to say that the brutal things that happen to her make her stronger. I feel like that's a little weird to say. But she's already a strong woman, and because she is a strong woman, she is able to withstand the bad things that happen to her. Now, a lot of times in these kinds of books, you have a hero's journey where you have the normal life of the hero, and they are ripped out of their normal life and thrust upon a path of a greater quest. Maybe a greater conspiracy, a greater truth that they will discover in the plot of the book. Now, that does not happen in Frostflower and Thorn. It is a very small plot. It is very narrowly focused on these two characters and their decision to, in the choice they make in dealing with her offspring. And part of me really liked that, because we are never given a plot device where they are told what to do because of a prophecy or because of some greater conspiracy that is not involved in their lives, something that they have to discover, something that they have to quest for. All of the plot revolves around these two women. And that is really cool to see that in this kind of fantasy story. However, it also leads to some pacing issues, because at about 3/4 through the book, I was really hoping for something more to happen. The book has some trouble creating a narrative momentum, has trouble creating narrative momentum and narrative drive, because it is so laser focused on this one aspect of the plot. And in addition to that, and because of that, the book takes place, the entire plot takes place in a very small area. I would say probably like 10 to 15 mile radius. The characters never leave this area, and they kind of travel back and forth between different locations in that area. And sometimes it feels like they are just going from one place to another without a lot of interesting things seen along the way. And so I think that maybe the book is just a little bit too long for what its plot dictates. Additionally, I think some of the pacing issues have to do with how long the chapters are. Now, there are only 14 chapters in this book, and a few of them are like 5 to 8 pages. 3 of them are almost 60 pages long, and it's not a 60-page single point of view, single set piece. It is multiple points of view, multiple set pieces, multiple plot points within those chapters, and they just feel too long. You never have that kind of natural break where an author could say, okay, we're going to stop here and we're going to pick up a few hours later. We're going to pick up sometime later. It really starts to drag down the book, and that is the main problem with the book, is just its lack of narrative momentum.
But everything else about the book I really enjoyed. I liked the writing. I liked the incredibly strong female characters. I liked that just the very fact that they were female and they were strong women was the focus point of the book. Again, you couldn't just perform a lazy gender swap with these two characters, make them men, and have the same story. You would have a completely different story, and one in which the world wouldn't even make sense because of the way that the land barons, the farmer priests, the way they control the world. They control both the agriculture and they control the religion. However, the source of the power in their religion actually comes from the female sorcerer. And they think, the priests think it comes from a divine source. And so there is this question throughout the novel. The question is do these farmer priests, do they actually believe in the mythology of the religion, or do they know the truth of the source of their power and what they do with that knowledge? How those competing systems of the way that the swordswomen and the sorcerer, the religion and the farmer priests, all of those systems, those social systems and those political systems, how they were all just intertwined and tangled together, and how they impact and affect one another is a really interesting core. It forms the most interesting core concepts of this book, and that is why I enjoyed it so much, even though there are problems with the pacing. I'm really looking forward to reading Frostflower and Windborn. I think it's going to be a really interesting follow-up because of just the way that this book ends, and not really a twist, but there is a kind of a cool revelation at the end. And I'm looking forward to seeing how that informs the next book in the series. So yeah, Frostflower and Thorn by Phyllis and Karr, highly recommended, especially if you are looking for a sword and sorcery, a work of sword and sorcery that is laser focused on female characters with a strong sense of feminism and an exploration of how those two things work within a kind of a typical male-dominated setting. And it's very interesting, well-written, and quite entertaining. So, all right, guys, well, I hope you enjoyed this video, and we will talk to you later. Bye-bye. Hey, everybody. Welcome back to the Dungeon Dive. Daniel here, and welcome back to the Sword and Sorcery Saga, a series in which we are taking a look at different works of sword and sorcery, sword and planet, and appendix in fiction. And we are kicking off this series in 2022 with a look at one of the big ones, one of the heavy hitters, and that is, of course, Michael Moorcock's Elric saga. So in this first episode, we are going to be taking a little look at my history with the series, a look at the history of the series in general, and then we will be doing detailed reviews of the first two books, the first two novels in the series, and that is Elric of Melnibone, published in 1972, and Sailor on the Seas of Fate, published in 1976. So first, a little word on the word Melnibone. There are many different ways to pronounce this word, and Michael Moorcock, the author, has himself said that there is really not one super right 100% correct way. There, as different readers read the word, they might pronounce it in a different way. I used to say Melnibone, but I am now trying to say Melnibone, and the people of Melnibone are called the Melniboneans. So that is the way that I'm saying the word now. I might revert back to an older way that I used to say it, which was Melnibone. But however you want to say it, it is a made-up fantasy word. So I guess just try to be consistent, but I may not be consistent. But as of right now, January 2022, the Elric Saga is my favorite work of sword and sorcery fiction. There might be something out there that I like more, and I'm hoping there is, because I always want to keep that option open of loving something new. But yeah, as of right now, the Elric Saga is my favorite. It perfectly captures everything I love about the genre, and it has informed many of the kinds of games and things I like to cover on this channel. It is relentlessly weird, told with brevity. It's somber, philosophical, and otherworldly.
So, for a long time, it was a little difficult to get into the Elric saga because it was difficult to know what to read and in what order to read. If you're interested in the publication history, I do recommend reading the Wikipedia article, which is just under the heading Elric of Melnibone. But it was originally serialized in at least one magazine, possibly more, released as short stories, novelettes, and novellas. Moorcock would then go on to rework and add connecting bits to turn the stories into novels, and he would also change the order of the stories to create an internal chronological order. The stories were originally told out of chronological order, and so that had to be modified when the novels were compiled and released. So this can lead to some tonal inconsistencies in the novels. It can create some stylistic inconsistencies, and it can also create some problems with plotting. But because of the overall dreamlike nature of the entire series, I don't really find this to be a problem. Each story, each book is better viewed as opening up a window, opening up a portal to a certain part of Elric's life, and we are allowed a glimpse of that portion of its life before the window closes, and then the world continues to exist while we are not reading. So my history with the series, I've probably first read them in 1991. I was in high school. I did have a science fiction and fantasy class, and for one of the best field trips ever, maybe the best field trip ever, our science fiction and fantasy class went to a bookstore, went to one of the new giant Barnes & Noble that had opened up in my hometown. And our assignment was to pick a book, buy it, and then do a report on it. And I was instantly drawn to the covers of the Ace Fantasy paperbacks drawn by Robert Gould. His color pencil art on the front just really spoke to me. I was really into color pencil art at the time. And I also really liked that the book was short, which means it would be easy to read for a class and do a report on. Additionally, the entire series was in print, and I was able to go back and get the rest of the series after finishing and loving Volume 1. Up until that point, most of my fantasy reading had been informed by Tolkien and, in turn, Dungeons & Dragons, with things like The Hobbit, Lord of the Rings, Dragonlance, Shannara, Tad Williams and the Dragonbone Chair, Xanth novels, and various other D&D and Forgotten Realms novels. In addition to game books like Lone Wolf and Fighting Fantasy. I had read small samplings of Sword and Sorcery at that point. Definitely some Conan, perhaps some Fafhrd and Grey Mouser, just various stories scattered in various anthologies from the library. But Elric was a very different kind of fantasy. Moorcock would purposefully set out to write an anti-Tolkien fantasy with this. And it was one that actually intensely spoke to my kind of Gen X sensibilities as I look back in time. I was drawn to Elric's sadness, his cynical outlook on life. If he was a teen in the 80s or early 90s, he might have been listening to The Smiths, The Cure, Zymox, or The Damned, something like that. It was a very anti-Tolkien approach. This wasn't a long, epic quest to save the world. These were shorter quests, shorter little adventures. And it also reminded me a great deal of the Games Workshop games that I was playing at the time. And I would later come to find that the Elric saga was a huge influence on Steve Jackson and Ian Livingston at Games Workshop. You had the great old ones, the old gods, the Lords of Law and Chaos, an ancient reptilian race that could have been the basis for the Cold Ones. You had otherworldly planes of existence, alien technology mixed in an old world setting, dangerous magic, cursed swords, and interdimensional travel. Elric was my gateway into a whole new world of fantastic fiction, one that would lead to a whole new world of weird fiction and much more. So I want to start off with a review of the saga and the novels by addressing a common complaint of Elric, the character, and his saga. And that complaint is that Elric is merely a pawn in his own stories. He rarely has agency. It often seems like his choices don't matter. He is like a dried leaf being blown by the winds of law and chaos to and fro from one adventure to the next. And while I think that is somewhat true, I don't view that as a negative. Elric is a tragedy. He is doomed from the get-go. It's even hinted at in his many nicknames and his many names that people call him, such as Elric Womanslayer, Elric Kinslayer, the Pale Prince of Ruins, the Doomed Prince. In the tragedy, a character cannot escape his fate. He must live with the cards he is dealt, and Elric has to live like that. We know it is a tragedy from the very beginning of Book 1. I want to read kind of like just a beginning paragraph here that gives that away. This is at the very beginning of Book 1. It's a little synopsis paragraph, a little introductory paragraph. It says, "On the island kingdom of Melnibone, all the old rituals are still observed, though the nation's power has waned for 500 years, and now her way of life is maintained only by her trade with the young kingdoms, and the fact that the city of Emir has become the meeting place of merchants. Are those rituals no longer useful? Can the rituals be denied and doom avoided? One who would rule in Emperor Elric's stead prefers to think not. He says that Elric will bring destruction to Melnibone by his refusal to honor all the rituals. Elric honors many. And now opens the tragedy, which will close many years from now and precipitate the destruction of this world." I mean, it pretty much lays it out right there in that beginning paragraph that this book is not going to have a happy ending. This saga is not going to have a happy ending. Elric's main quest throughout all the books is to rid himself of this doom, most likely through his own death, his own demise. Here we have a fantasy where the main character's goal is not to save the world, but the main character's goal is to probably commit suicide, to rid himself of the doom and the doom he passes around. His quest ultimately is to reach the city of Tanalorn, a city existing beyond the influences of law and chaos, a city where Elric can escape his fate, rest in peace, and not bring doom upon all he encounters. So now let's take a look at Elric of Melnibone, and this is the first volume, the first novel, and this is part 1. I do want to read a little bit of the opening chapter here, and that chapter is called "A Melancholy King, a Court Strives to Honor Him." It is the color of a bleached skull, his flesh, and the long hair which flows below his shoulders is milk white. From the tapering, beautiful head stare 2 slanting eyes, crimson and moody, and from the loose sleeves of his yellow gown emerge 2 slender hands, also the color of bone, resting on each arm of a seat which has been carved from a single massive ruby. The crimson eyes are troubled, and sometimes one hand will rise to finger the light helm which sits upon the white locks. A helm made from some dark greenish alloy and exquisitely molded into the likeness of a dragon about to take wing. And on the hand which absently caresses the crown, there is a ring in which is set a single rare octorius stone, whose core sometimes shifts sluggishly and reshapes itself, as if it were sentient smoke and as restless in its jeweled prison as the young albino on his ruby throne. So there we get a little example of Moorcock's prose. It is kind of flowery and lyrical, and that would make sense because Moorcock would go on to contribute lyrics and music to quite a few, I believe, at least a handful of prog rock bands in the 70s, especially with Hawkwind, which he worked on an album of Elric saga stories and songs with Hawkwind. So much happens in the first book of this series. If this was written by a modern author for a modern publisher, this single book would probably be an entire trilogy
with each volume being 500 plus pages. But instead we are presented with a very slim volume that's under 200 pages, and it is absolutely overflowing with plot and creativity. Moorcock creates a fantasy reduction in which all of the fat is trimmed and boiled away. In this, he creates a work that is purposefully anti-Tolkien, purposefully anti-epic in a way. And the book is divided into 3 parts. The first part sets up Elric's character. His love in his life is Cimmeril. And it sets up his reluctance to rule over the ancient kingdom of Melnibone. His ultimate betrayal at the hands of his wicked cousin Yyrkoon. Melnibone is an ancient and dying kingdom geographically flanked by the young kingdoms. And it's finding its place in the world threatened. As Roland might say, the world has moved on for the Melniboneans. It is a kingdom inhabited by a race of cruel and uncaring people. The Melniboneans are into torture, they maim and mutilate. The first chapter describes a chorus of singers that they have, who each one has been surgically altered to sing but one perfect note. They are cold, they are deceitful and malicious. The outsiders call it an Isle of Demons, and Elric wants no part of it. We also learn here that Elric is addicted to potions to keep himself physically fit. What we're going to see time and time again throughout the series is that Elric's power does not come from within. Many fantasies are about the power within the hero, or a heroine discover that he had the power all along. But Elric's power mostly comes from external sources and from his curiosity to learn and to gain knowledge. He himself is weak and frail. His power comes from potions, from his magical sword, and from the gods of chaos. Left to his own devices, he would be a pathetic albino, not able to die, but also not able to fully live. The second part of the book sets the stage for Elric's interactions with the lords of law and chaos and the gods of the earth and land, or the sea and land, I should say. This part establishes the pantheon of the world and shows how the powerful and external divine how powerful, I should say, the external divine beings really are. Elric is granted the use of a ship which sails over land and sea, but he is also tossed around like a plaything and kind of discarded like an old toy by the gods of land and sea. While the gods may grant Elric extreme power, they also really make sure that he knows his place, he knows his station. He needs them. They don't need him. The third part of the book details Elric's violent clash with Yyrkoon, his evil cousin, and the quest for 2 rune blades, Stormbringer and Mournblade. On his quest through the marshes of Limbo and through the tunnel of pulsating flesh, Elric meets Rakir the Red Archer, a warrior priest of Foom. Rakir is another manifestation of the Eternal Champion, and so is Elric. And this is probably the earliest hint of the Elric saga being tied to a multiverse of characters and stories that Moorcock has created. The Eternal Champion is a kind of hero throughout the ages of time and space. And Moorcock writes about many incarnations of this champion, and they often appear in each other's books, creating this intertwined multi-universe. But like most people who meet Elric, Rakir's eventual fate is not a pleasant one. Elric finally finds his black rune sword Stormbringer, his cousin gets Mournblade, and this even more securely seals Elric's doomed fate. Because Stormbringer, it's a cursed sword. It's a physical manifestation of a chaos demon that feeds upon the souls of all who the blade cuts. The souls give power to Elric, and they also power the sword. But Elric is he's often unable to control the sword because it is its own sentient killing machine. And in one of the main decisions that Elric makes throughout his saga, a final decision that will lead to even more doom, Elric decides to spare his cousin's life. Yyrkoon is returned to Melnibone to act as a standing emperor while Elric abandons his kingdom in search of adventure and possibly peace in the Young Kingdoms. He's on a quest for knowledge, a quest for adventure, really. And in one of the most ironic ending lines in all of fantasy, Elric proclaims with some amount of optimism, "I shall be a new man when I return to Melnibone." That line really stuck out to me when I was reading the series this time. So now on to book 2, Sailor on the Seas of Fate, and I want to read this opening paragraph, this little introduction here. And this says, "Due to recent disruptions in the fabric of our worlds, beings have been released who would not otherwise have the power they now possess. And possessing great power, they crave for more, for all the power that there is in our universe. They are outside the power of any of our gods. So a more powerful group has been summoned, yourselves, the champions eternal, in 4 of his incarnations, and 4 is the maximum number we can risk without precipitating further unwelcome disruptions among the planes of Earth. Ericos, Elric, Coram, and Hawkmoon." And that really does lead into this first part. So right off the bat, what we're going to quickly find is that even though there is a chronological order to the saga, there are large gaps in time. Things happen in between the novels that we don't know. And Moorcock really isn't concerned with creating a point-by-point, strongly serialized work throughout the novels. Like I said before, each book, each story is just a glimpse into a certain part of Elric's life. So Sailor of the Seas of Fate contains 3 novellas, each one focusing on an adventure as Elric sails the mystic seas. Book 1 is called Sailing to the Future, and it is on its own one of my favorite works of all fantasy. It's absolutely bonkers, and Elric finds himself stranded on this island. He often finds himself trapped and then miraculously gets rescued and gets thrust into some other adventure, thus leading to that kind of complaint that I read earlier, or we talked about earlier. And he is rescued by this boat, this magic sailing vessel that emanates its own mist. And on that sailing vessel, he is joined by 3 other incarnations of the Eternal Champion. Each of them is given charge over a band of warriors, and they are sent on a quest to destroy 2 sorcerers. And this is where the series really starts to show its alien and otherworldly leanings. I'm pretty sure that one of the evil sorcerers that they have to fight is actually a sentient spaceship. And the other is like its pilot, who shares this biological and symbiotic connection. And the 4 Eternal Champions also pull a total Voltron move, and they combine together into this single monstrous entity that has a head with 4 faces, each facing in a cardinal direction, 8 arms, and all of these crazy swords. It's totally insane and amazing. Book 2 is called Sailing to the Present, and unfortunately, I don't think this part really holds up after the amazing first part. This is kind of like the first kind of dip, I think, in quality in the Elric stories. It's not bad, it just feels like a few steps back from everything that has come before it. And this is really kind of a gothic love/ghost story in which Elric finds himself entangled in a domestic and supernatural dispute. But it is here that he meets another one of his doomed companions, and that is Count Smorgon Baldhead. Great name. There are some amazing names in the Elric saga. Book 3 is called Sailing to the Past, and it really ends the book on a high note. And it is here that we have one of the purest kind of sword and sorcery style stories featuring Elric. The doomed prince, along with his new companion, Count Smorgon Baldhead, they find passage on a new ship which leads them on a new quest, one in which they travel back in time to the ancient city that could be the very birthplace of the Melniboneans, and perhaps the cradle of life for the Chaos Gods. It is also a place where a violent and ancient reptilian race exists, perhaps the basis for the Cold Ones in Warhammer. This is a classic tale of treasure hunting, monster slaying, and jungle exploration. And once again, things don't turn out well for those who link their lives with Elric. So the best thing I can say about Elric, and really a great kind of conclusion to this first episode, is that
The stories are rarely formulaic. You almost never know what you're going to get once you start a new Elric story. Each one is different, and Moorcock is he's never afraid to embrace the weird and the outlandish and the otherworldly. Moorcock refers to Elric as sword and philosophy, and during these two books we do start to see that, as Elric and his companions often talk about the meaning of life, existential nihilism, and what it means for them just to exist in their own worlds. There is an alien-like mist that permeates the entire saga, one that makes the world feel bizarre and dangerous. While it is a work of fantasy, there also seems to be elements of science fiction and perhaps even some post-apocalyptic genres scattered about. And it is a work of fantasy that fully embraces the fantastic. It is not afraid to be a work of fantasy, of the fantasy genre. Like, I feel like so many modern fantasies, they seem ashamed of what they are, but Elric embraces it in all of its meaning. And that really is why I love it so much. Sorry guys, I hope you enjoyed this first episode, taking a look at the Elric saga. Come back probably in a couple weeks where we will take a look at books 3 and 4. Sorry guys, well, I'll talk to you later. Take it easy. Bye-bye. Hey everybody, welcome back to the Dungeon Dive. Daniel here, and welcome back to the Sword and Sorcery Saga and our continuing coverage of the Elric saga from Michael Moorcock. And today we are going to take a look at the next two books, books 3 and 4. And those books are The Weird of the White Wolf and The Vanishing Tower. In books 3 and 4 of the Elric saga, they deal with Elric's exploits as he continues to basically seal his doom while traveling throughout the Young Kingdoms. And these stories specifically kind of focus on his travels and adventures with his companion Moonglum. And each of these two books is made up of 3 novellas. They are loosely tied together with kind of an overarching plot in which Elric is chasing down his kind of arch rival in the series, who just kind of comes out of nowhere in a kind of a weird way, this evil sorcerer from Pan Tang. So Weird of the White Wolf, book 3, we're just going to jump right into it here. And this is from 1977, that it was originally published. And I'm going to read the back of the Ace Fantasy book, my reading copy. And this says, the albino emperor meets Queen Yashana. Now sword and man are one. Elric's awesome loneliness, ironically, is ended. And the eternal champion and his blade Stormbringer must go forth through havoc and horror to carve out their destiny. So this volume contains 2 of the very earliest Elric stories that were written and published, and it kind of exemplifies one of the issues I brought up in my original video about the kind of tonal and style inconsistencies. The stories here do feel a little rough around the edges, and it's kind of weird coming from like books 1 and 2, which you would think were earlier, and you would expect a series as it went to get better in terms of style, prose, and consistency. But here, because the publishing order and the internal chronological order was so jumbled up while Moorcock was working on the story, that's not actually the case here. So these stories aren't bad. They're just not as polished as the stories we've already read in the series, at least in my opinion. And this is simply due to Moorcock becoming a better writer as time went on, perhaps having a better grasp of the character and his own style and really the themes that are present in these stories. In contrast to how the stories were written and published, really, and it's just the nature of Elric. And while this has always been my least favorite of the 6 core Elric books, it does contain one novella, one section that I absolutely love. So the book here, it begins with a prologue, and the prologue is called The Dream of Earl Abeck. And here it says that we learn something of how the age of the young kingdoms emerged. And this prologue gives us a bit of the mythological history of Elric's world. And it is one of the kind of few rare examples of Moorcock concerning himself with world building. At some point, I should probably do a whole episode about my feelings on world building. Here they are, kind of just in a very small nutshell. I don't like how obsessed modern fantasy authors and fans of modern fantasy are with world building. World building really does almost nothing for me in the modern context of it. I rarely care about the history, the language, the magical systems, the politics, or the geography or the economics of fictional worlds. And this is one of the reasons why I love the Elric stories so much, and one of the reasons why I do tend to prefer older fantasy so much. Moorcock almost never pauses the plot to tell the readers about these things. He throws around proper nouns of people and places like they're going out of style, and basically just asks the reader to keep up. He almost never gives us context to what is happening, and we just kind of have to fill in a lot of the blanks for ourselves. And so I appreciate that in a work of fantasy, and a lot of modern fantasy. I kind of call it like the Brian Saunderson problem, where they're just so full of world building and describing in detail magical systems. It was like modern fantasy writers, they looked at Tolkien's The Silmarillion and said, yes, this is the blueprint for all modern fantasy going forward. And that it just really does nothing for me. So I am glad that Elric is short on the world building. But the first proper story here is called The Dreaming City. And if you remember in the first video, I remarked about the irony of Elric's optimism when he stated he would be a new man when he returned home. Well, this is what I was referring to. This story tells of how Elric returned to his home city, his home region, his kingdom, and basically destroyed the entire city with a band of pirates, of raiders. And he killed his cousin, he accidentally kills the love of his life, and basically burns and razes his home country to the ground. And I think here it's pretty apparent that Moorcock is kind of giving the middle finger to fantasy's obsession with tradition and the past. He's making a statement with Elric that Elric is going to burn down the kind of fantasy that had come before it. And this is kind of like Moorcock's statement here. It's very blunt, it's very on the nose. But again, I think this was coming from a younger writer. And I feel like this story really is Moorcock stating his thematic goals with the Elric saga. The second story we have here is called While the Gods Laugh. And this is the one that I love the most. I think this story is absolutely fantastic. I think it's here that Moorcock gives Elric his real purpose. In this story, Elric and Moonglum join forces with a woman named Shirilla, and together they embark on a quest for the Dead Gods book. And this is a book that might contain the knowledge of the gods and the cosmos. Elric becomes obsessed with reading the book so he can discover the answer to an age-old question. Is there an ultimate God reigning over all creation? Is there a purpose to anything? Is there something outside the constant manipulation of the gods and the orders of law and chaos? And this story really does introduce Elric's existential quest for the answers to life's greatest mysteries. And like most of Elric's endeavors, it ends in utter failure and doom. So I wanted to read a little bit about that here. So this is from page 77 of the Ace paperback edition. And he says, "Very well then," Elric said eventually, "but it is not easy to answer you in a few sentences. I desire, if you like, to know one of two things." He's talking to Shirilla about why he wants to find this book. And she asks, "And what is that, Elric?" The tall albino dropped the folded tent to the grass and sighed. His fingers played nervously with the pommel of his rune sword. "Can an ultimate god exist or not? That is what I need to know, Shirilla, if my life is to have any direction at all. The lords of law and chaos now govern our lives, but is there some being greater than them?" Shirilla put her hand on Elric's arm. "Why must you know?" she said. "Despairingly, sometimes, I seek the comfort of a benign god, Shirilla. My mind goes out, lying awake at night, searching through black barrenness for something, anything, which will take me to it, warm me, protect me, tell me that there is order in the chaotic tumble of the universe, that it is consistent, this precision of the planets, not simply a brief, bright spark of sanity in an eternity of malevolent anarchy." Elric sighed, with his quiet tones were tinged with hopelessness. "Without some confirmation of the order of things, my only comfort is to accept the anarchy. This way I can revel in chaos and know without fear that we are all doomed from the start, that our brief existence is both meaningless and damned." So I really like that dialogue exchange, and Elric really kind of as an angsty character kind of lays it all on the line there. But the story is not all existential dread. This story is overflowing with the kind of questing adventure I love, and we love as viewers of the Dungeon Dive love, and this would make a fantastic RPG module. You get caves, underground lakes, strange and otherworldly locations, magic, puzzles, and loot. And Moonglum also adds some much-needed levity to Elric's brooding, and the two make a very interesting adventuring pair. The final novel in the Weird of the White Wolf is The Singing Citadel, and this should be especially interesting for fans of Games Workshop's The Silver Tower. So longtime viewers of the Dungeon Dive will know how much I love that game. In this story, Elric basically travels to a dungeon that is the Silver Tower. And this must have been a great inspiration for Games Workshop and in the development of the Chaos God Tzeentch. In this novel, we're introduced to two important players in Elric's saga that will reappear from time to time. And they are Queen Yashana and Thalab Karna, a wizard of Pantang, which I mentioned earlier, kind of in a kind of offbeat, weird way, becomes Elric's kind of arch enemy in this saga. So with Elric in the mix, these three form a kind of strange love triangle embroiled in treachery, passion, backstabbing, and sorcery. In this novella, Elric infiltrates a magical fortress, aka the Silver Tower, to do battle with Lord Ballo. He is a lord of the higher realms, kind of a mix between Loki and the Gaunt Summoner from Silver Tower, whose goal it is to, and I quote, "establish my own realm on Earth, a realm of paradox, a little from law and a little from chaos, a realm of opposites, of curiosities and jokes." And once again, Elric finds himself as a pawn and just a plaything of the Lords of Law and Chaos. Really, really cool story. Really good ending to the Weird of the White Wolf. So coming up next and last today is the Vanishing Tower, also published in 1977. And I'm going to read the back of the Ace paperback version here. And this is The Gateway. Elric, cursed and beloved of the gods, follows his Black Hellblade Stormbringer into the Vanishing Tower, gateway to the myriad planes of earth and time, and to countless hells that are his destiny. Again, this book is comprised of 3 novellas, and this has always been one of my favorite Elric books. I like all 3 stories in here, straight out of the gate. The writing and style in this collection is a huge improvement over The Weird of the White Wolf. You could tell that Moorcock was a more seasoned, more comfortable, more confident writer, more confident in his capabilities as an author, and both the characters and the plots are better for it. So while Weird of the White Wolf ranks as one of my least favorites, this definitely is, like I said, one of my most favorites. It has some truly amazing chapter titles, that are just screaming to be made song titles for like a folk metal band like Agalloch or something, or Runes of Beverast. This says, like, here's some chapter examples. Pale Prince on a moonlit shore, feathers filling a great sky, old castle standing alone, black wizard laughing, a great host screaming, the stolen ring, the cold ghouls. Just fantastic, totally metal chapter titles. I love it. And once again, Moorcock just crams more plot into this single volume than many authors do in a series ranging thousands of pages long. This short volume, under 200 pages, is absolutely overflowing with amazing fantasy, action, otherworldly locales, and strange beings. The 3 novellas here are The Torment of the Last Lord, To Snare the Pale Prince, and 3 Heroes with a Single Aim. All 3 are structurally similar. They are all very basic kind of questing stories, and all 3 feature they feature a traditional questing plot in which Elric and Moonglum are hired or coerced into some kind of harrowing situation. The Torment of the Last Lord contains one of the all-time just kind of gross and nasty magical spells. It's called the Noose of Flesh. And if you've seen or read Akira, the Japanese manga or anime, imagine at the end of that how Tetsuo is kind of exploding in this weird, just giant globule of flesh and enveloping everybody around him. That's what this Noose of Flesh does. It's really, really cool. To snare a Pale Prince has a villain and an atmosphere that fans of From Software game will absolutely adore. If you like games like Demon Souls or Dark Souls, or in like 10-15 days, Elden Ring, rip the dungeon dive. Well, once Elden Ring comes out, you will absolutely love this chapter and this section here. So in book 2, To Snare the Pale Prince, chapter 1, The Beggar Court. I'm just going to read a little bit about this. This is about a city of beggars called Nadsukar, and it was infamous throughout the Young Kingdoms, lying near the shores of that ferocious river, the Varkalk, and not too far from the kingdom of Org, in which blossomed the frightful fortress of Truz, and exuding the stink which seemed thick enough 10 miles distance, Nadsukar was plagued by few visitors. So as you can see, just in that very first paragraph, Moorcock mentions a bunch of places that we have no idea. He's not concerned with world building. He is concerned with setting up an atmosphere and just sprinkling in names of things to give the world a sense of place, but without bogging down the story. But this goes on to describe the king of the beggars. Their king had ruled for many years. He was called Urish the Seven-Fingered, for he had but 4 fingers on his right hand and 3 upon his left. Veins had burst all over his once handsome face, and filthy infested hair framed that seedy countenance upon which age and grime had traced 1,000 lines. From out of all this ruin peered 2 bright, pale eyes. As the symbol of his power, Orish had a great cleaver called Hackmeat, which was forever at his side. His throne was of crudely carved black oak, studded with bits of raw gold, bones, and semi-precious gems. Beneath the throne was Urish's hoard, a chest of treasure which he let none but himself look upon. Totally just a villain, a boss straight out of a Dark Souls or Demon Souls game. Absolutely love that. And that is also just a fantastic story there. And then we have the 3 heroes with a single aim. Further examines in quite a bit of detail the nature of the metaverse, of which Elric is a part of, his Moorcock's metaverse, which all of these characters are kind of this different incarnate of the Eternal Champion. Here, Elric again teams up with various incarnations of the Eternal Champion, and how each is doing his part in their own individual realms, but they're also kind of working together to save the very fabric of space and time. The city of Tanalorn also plays an important role in this book. We learn a little bit about its place outside of the reaches of powers of law and chaos. It is a refuge for people who are tired of being the pawns in a cosmic game played by opponents oblivious to the lives of those they are manipulating. It is a place of peace, of refuge. It is a place that I find appealing today. I wish a place like this existed. A place where people could just live their lives in peace outside of the influence of religion and politics. It's a place of humanity. It's a place of compassion, of caring, because we don't have to worry about these external forces that are constantly beating us down. And that's really why Elric wants to find this the city, but when he finds it, I think he kind of gets bored with it. He gets bored without having some kind of anger or drama in his life. And so the stories in this volume, they're the kind that really tickle my imagination. Each one of these could easily be the basis for an adventure game or an RPG model. These are perfect examples of the kind of fantasy I love. Stories about weird characters, strange locales, otherworldly powers, told with brevity, plotted with a kind of reckless abandon one might find in a 90s Hong Kong action film. If you stop to really think about what's going on, it doesn't make a ton of sense because you have to fill in a ton of dots and things seem to be kind of scattershot all over the place. As the characters, they don't have a ton of agency in what they're doing. But when I let my mind be swept away by the momentum of the plot and the strangeness of the atmosphere, I can't help but read these stories with a huge smile on my face. And with the Vanishing Tower, that is especially true. I did have a smile on my face almost the entire time I was reading this. So much great adventure and atmosphere and just really cool, weird things happening. So, all right, guys, well, next time we will take a look at books 5 and 6, and then we will move on to maybe, I think, a couple extra little short stories with Elric and a couple of the novels that Moorcock wrote later to kind of go back in and plug some holes. So take it easy, guys. We will talk to you later. Bye-bye. Hey everybody, welcome back to the Dungeon Dive. Daniel here. I hope you are doing well, and if you're not, I hope you are soon. Alright, today we're going to return to the Sword and Sorcery Saga series with something a little different, and that is a look at the Taschen coffee table book, Masterpieces of Fantasy Art. I know it has been a while since I've done an episode for the Sword and Sorcery Saga, and that's simply because I've just been reading other things, but we will return to it soon, and we will conclude the reviews of the Elric books. But today I wanted to take a look at something a little different, and that is this art book, because it's amazing, and I've been wanting to get it on the channel for some time. So this book is from the incredible publisher Taschen, and it is put together and partially written by Diane Hansen. Diane Hansen is kind of in charge of Taschen's adult series. She does their body series, which is kind of like erotic photography. She has also been involved in the adult magazine industry. And I think it kind of makes sense to incorporate this kind of fantasy art into the body genre, because so much of the things that we value in fantasy art are actually the depictions of the human form. And I think it's kind of important to celebrate those in the way that Diane Hansen kind of celebrates the human body in a sexual way. So saying that, there is going to be a lot of nudity, artistic nudity shown in this video. So if that is something that you don't want to see, or maybe your kids, you don't want your kids to see or something, you may want to skip this video. So just a word of warning there. But this book is absolutely massive. It's a little hard to get everything on the screen. There we go. A big old clunk there. It weighs over 16 pounds. It's the biggest book that I own. It ships in this huge kind of like cardboard box that you can keep to keep everything safe. It's a little hard to read because it's so big and heavy. I know Taschen does sell like pedestals for these giant books that you can set them on to read them easier. But I'm not that crazy. Yeah, so let's take a look at this book here. We're not going to flip through every single page, but we'll take a good look so you can really get an idea if this book is something that you want to invest in. It's about a $200 book. There are still copies available, but they are becoming more and more rare. And there are only 7,000 of these first editions made. So my number is number 2045 there. Some of the pages are these really heavy cardstock with nice texture. The binding is really nice. This is a book that if you keep, if you treat well, this is a book that you could pass down. This is like an heirloom book. It's well made. The binding is all stitched really finely. So yeah, just a fantastic book. Tons of great art. I mean, that really is the focus of the book, is the art and the different kind of artists that it focuses on. So on certain pages, there are these prints that are attached to the page that you can view. And then underneath the print, it does tell you a little bit about the painting. And here we have the table of contents. So like a lot of the Taschen books, hold on, I just want to get this centered more and get a better view. So like a lot of the Taschen books, the writing is done in different languages. So because they are a worldwide publisher and they put out their books worldwide, a lot of times you will have the articles in the book, the chapters are written in English, and then they are reproduced. And I think in this version, it is German and French. Most of the writing in this book was done by Diane Hansen. And then we do have a beginning chapter here, which is called My Fantasy Life, which was written by Boris Vallejo. And then a few of the sections were also written by Zach Smith, kind of a controversial figure in the realms of role-playing and fantasy. But my love for Zach Smith's work does not necessarily translate to my love for Zach Smith, the man. Let's just say that. So yeah, so we start off with a chapter by Boris Vallejo called My Fantasy Life. And then we get into 3 sections written by Diane Hansen, and that is Fantasy Now, Then, Now, and Always, Fantasy, and then Fantasy Art Origins, and Fantasy or Science Fiction. Just kind of a nice history on the fantasy art tradition. And then we get into the chapters that focus on the different artists. This is probably the part where I have the most complaints about the book, and I think everybody will have their complaints about this book in the artists that they chose to focus on. I think that they could have combined a couple. Like we have sections on Julie Bell and Boris Vallejo. I think you could easily combine that couple, because they are actually a couple, into a single chapter, thus giving way for some other artists. I would have liked to have seen an entire chapter focusing on the artists at TSR, or maybe focusing on a Japanese artist like Amano or somebody. But you have chapters on Julie Bell, chapter on Philip Droulet, Frank Frazetta, H.R. Giger. Again, I would not have, if I was putting this book together, I would not have included H.R. Giger as one of the artists to focus on. Personal preference, I'm not into his art at all, and I kind of think like it really sticks out in this book. The brothers Hildebrandt, Jeffrey Catherine Jones, Rodney Matthews, Mobius, Rowena Morel, San Julian, Boris Vallejo, and Michael Whalen, a Dungeon Dive favorite. I would maybe even have liked to have seen some Gary Chalk in here, possibly. And then the final chapter is really cool because you have small sections on 99 different fantasy artists, and that's a really, really fun section. But so here we have the Boris Vallejo chapter on My Fantasy Life. Some art by Boris Vallejo there. What's really nice is you do get a there are descriptions of all of the different pieces of art, and those descriptions will be both in all of them are in English. So even during the chapters that are written in German or in French, you can still look and you can tell which page is uses which art. But this is a really cool chapter on the history of fantasy art and how important the depictions of fantastic things, of heroic things, were to the kind of development of human history and our experiences with the art. Humanity has always been interested in heroes and in depicting heroic feats and things of fantasy in our art. And it's a very important tradition to our being human. And this does a really good job of kind of going through that history and talking about the importance of the heroic tradition in fantasy art. And you get some really, really great pieces here. This William Blake piece I absolutely love. Man, William Blake was amazing. I mean, he could have had a whole chapter in here, really. And then we also get some nice depictions of some of the pulp covers there. Just really great. I don't look at this book a lot. I keep it in its box. It's so big, it's just kind of unwieldy, and sometimes it's like work to take a look at it, but I'll pull it out of its box every couple months or so and just set it up on a table and just spend a couple hours flipping through it and having a really good time looking at everything. A nice Kelly Freyos there. We looked at some of his art. We were taking a look at some of the vintage science fiction covers, some old covers for Philip K. Dick there. These are the original triptych here, the original paintings for the Ballantine versions of Lord of the Rings. And if I remember correctly, what was really interesting was that the artist had not actually read the books yet by the time that they did the art, which is kind of cool. Kind of just get this impressionistic feeling of the books. Bernie Wrightson, like I would have liked to have seen like a chapter on Bernie Wrightson or maybe Michael Plug instead of H.R. Giger. I don't think Giger's a bad artist by any means, but I don't really consider him fantasy. I do consider him more science fiction. And I'm just really kind of not into his kind of like bioorganic style, biomechanical style there. That is great. Very classic feel there, Caldwell. Clyde Caldwell. See, like a Clyde Caldwell chapter, or like combining Larry Elmore and Clyde Caldwell into a TSR chapter would have been amazing. I would have loved to see that. But again, we have the Art of Dungeons and Dragons book that has all of that in it. I guess we should take a look at that at some time as well. Another classic kind of Art Nouveau style there. But Irish artist Harry Clark. God, that's really pretty. I like that a lot. Man, I mean, every time I look through this book, I discover some new artists that I need to like jot down so I can go and investigate and learn more about them. So much cool stuff. Okay, so then once we get through that beginning section, then we get to the artist section. And the first artist up here is, of course, Julie Bell. Julie Bell, the bodybuilder, kind of, depicting the human form in its topmost quality. And once again, I would have rather seen Julie and Bell and Boris combined into a single chapter, because they work so much together. I mean, I think Bell was like one of his models for some of his art. It would have been neat to see them included together, but I also appreciate that they kept them separate, because I'm sure sometimes maybe Bell feels like she's maybe a little under, often mentioned under Vallejo, so it is nice to see her get her own chapter. I can totally get down with that. I like her art, I don't love it. Same with Boris Vallejo. I like his art, I don't love it. It's a little like airbrushy for me. It's a little kind of side of a van style, but some of her stuff I think is pretty cool. I really like her use of color. And of course, her depiction of the human form cannot be argued with. It's quite stunning. And then after Julie Bell, we get to Philip Droulet here. Again, we have our nice print here. Very unique artist. Bold, thick lines with good use of color. Kind of a little more chaotic than you see, a little more sketchy than you see in a lot of fantasy art. So that's really cool to see. Love that piece there. Kind of a feeling of agony. I love this one here. Yeah, his line work is really something. I love that thick ink that he uses to do his lines, and just all the little line work. Reminds me a little bit of a more kind of a bolder Mobius style. I'm sure they worked together. They kind of came up around the same time. Really nice stuff here, though. And then after Droulet, of course, we come to the one and only Frank Frazetta, who's really, the importance of Frank Frazetta to the fantasy tradition cannot be overstated. The man that launched 1,000 art school careers. It's so easy to take Frazetta's work and his impact on the genre for granted. I love the fact that they call his chapter The God, and that really is true. There really was nobody better, and there probably will never be anybody better than Frazetta. He defined so many things that we think of when we think of fantasy art. And he did it in a way that was such a bold statement. Somewhere in the book, Diane Hansen writes that, nobody drew flesh. Nobody created flesh like Frank Frazetta. And he depicted like pockmarks and dimples and just stretch marks and ripples. And yeah, it's just like, it's so fleshy. His work feels fleshy. And man, he is just fantastic. Really can't say enough good things about Frank Frazetta. I mean, it's just take it for granted that people are going to love Frazetta. I've never met anybody who looks at Frank Frazetta's art and just like, he's okay. It's always just like straight up love. His use of color, of composition. He was a master. One of the very, very best pop artists of all time. I feel like stupid just talking about Frank Frazetta, really. And then after Frazetta, we come to Giger. Again, a good artist and very creative. I think for me, a little one note in his themes and what he depicts. Very talented, just not my style. And I would have rather just have seen a different artist take up these pages. I do like this spread though there. That is very nice. I think when it comes to, yeah, I don't know. I guess I just I'm not really into his like biomechanical kind of weird organic look. But let's put it this way. A lot of times with this fantasy art, I see the worlds and I see the things depicted and created, and I want to go into those worlds. I want to experience them. I want to live in them. I want to adventure in them. I want to take part of them. And with Giger, I don't. So I think I think I'm having that kind of reaction to his art. So in that sense, the art is very successful. It just doesn't do for me what I want fantasy art to do. And speaking of that, we come to kind of like the exact opposite of Giger, and that is the brothers Hildebrandt. The brothers Hildebrandt are probably like if you were to say to somebody, imagine a piece of fantasy artwork in your mind. I think the brothers Hildebrandt would probably be the kind of art that somebody would think of. Of course, they did some work with Star Wars, but this right here, this Fellowship of the Ring piece here is absolutely gorgeous. Just like kind of like the prototypical fantasy art right here. And that is the brothers Hildebrandt. The best way to describe them. Lots of dragons and wizards and warriors, fairies, all that kind of stuff. My first probably encounter with them was probably these old editions of the Sword of Shannara. I still have my old mass market paperback of that, so I didn't know who they were then, but I always loved that cover. And I love their depiction of the Tolkien stuff. Really cool. I want to adventure in their worlds. And then coming up next is another Dungeon Dive favorite, the late great Jeffrey Catherine Jones. Fantastic artist. They were just had a very unique style, somewhat abstract, very painterly. I've got a lot of books with their art on the cover. I always, if I see a Jeffrey Catherine Jones cover, I will almost always buy the book just to have that picture on my shelf. They did the cover or the poster for Dragon Slayer, that old 80s movie. I've been actually wanting to rewatch that. I could not tell you if it is good or bad. It has been probably 30 years since I've seen it. Maybe even longer. I can't remember when it came out. Maybe 1984 or something around there. Fantastic work there. Rodney Matthews. Rodney Matthews is probably the artist in this featured in this book that I know the least about. And from what I can tell, he did a lot of album covers. Rodney playing drums with the second band, Squid, at the Glastonbury Film Festival. Kind of looks like Nick Mason there. I think a lot of people looked like Nick Mason. He had that kind of prototypical 70s look. Really nice depiction of Elric there. Yeah, lots of album covers. Yeah, I'm not super familiar with Rodney Matthews, so I need to investigate his work more because some of it I really like. I mean, that is awesome. Kind of some kind of like tree demon or thing there. Very cool. What was that? Time on Our Side, commissioned in 2016 for the Rolling Stones compilation records. Huh? Rolling Stone. Oh yeah, there's the Rolling Stones there depicted as these like dwarves. That's kind of cool. Interesting. Huh? I like that. I'm not a huge fan of the Rolling Stones, but as warrior dwarves, I can get behind that. Really nice landscape there. I would like to play a game in that setting. That's kind of where my mind goes when I'm enjoying fantasy art is, do I want to game in that setting? And see, now this is kind of a biomechanical. This is kind of Giger-esque, but this appeals to me more than Giger's work does. All right, and then we have, of course, Mobius. Mobius needs no introduction. My introduction to Mobius was kind of roundabout in a way, and that was by reading the Miyazaki manga for Nausicaa, because Mobius actually encouraged Miyazaki to do the comic. And then in one of my earlier editions of the Nausicaa comic had a fold-out poster of Nausicaa drawn by Mobius, and I really liked him. And then I went back and discovered that I was familiar with his work through like heavy metal and stuff, and I just didn't know that. And then he, of course, became just a lifetime favorite of mine. I love his work with just really soft color. His work with filmmaker Jodorowsky produced some incredible comic books like the Inkal. And yeah, Mobius he's a classic. I personally put him up there with Frazetta. I think he's maybe a little more sci-fi. He hasn't quite established as many tropes, as many traditions as Frazetta, but he did influence a lot of people who I really love. And then after Frazetta, or after Mobius, we have Rowena Morrill. Her work, again, is very kind of traditional, kind of a Boris Vallejo, Julie Bell, that kind of 80s traditional style. Lots of dragons, lots of perfect depictions of the human form. A little airbrushy for me, but I still think her work is really nice. I love Theodore Sturgeon, but I do not have this version of Venus Plus X. I do like that cover. I should try to track that one down. That's really nice there. That's got a really nice feel to it. That almost looks like a Frazetta, especially the flesh on this beast here, this kind of like weird butterfly dragon beast. She did do the cover for an Alfred Bester novel, Golem 100, which is pretty cool. That's a weird novel. Half of it is really good. The first quarter of the novel I would put up there with The Star Is My Destination and The Demolished Man, but it kind of falls apart after that. It's still a really bizarre book. If you're a fan of Alfred Bester, I do recommend reading it. And then here we have Saint Julien. Again, another really painterly artist. I like that quite a bit there. That's really nice. Vampirella there. Some great old pulp magazine covers. Really well done there. That is fantastic, and so is that. Really good work. And then we have Boris Vallejo. I know Boris Vallejo is super popular. It looks a little too airbrushy for me personally. But I'm not saying anything about his talent. He is an immense talent, of course. And he defined a lot of that style. He defined kind of like the decade of like the 80s. He did some great stuff. I always loved the poster he did for National Lampoon's Vacation. Really cool. Barbarella. Naked women with panthers or cheetahs. That seemed to be a popular motif in the 80s. Weird animals. That that eagle creature is really buff. All right, and then after Vallejo, we come to Dungeon Dive favorite, and that is Michael Whelan. Of course, the great Michael Whelan, who did all of the great covers, my favorite covers for the DAW editions of the Elric Saga. And he has just done so much work with the DAW Fantasies, DAW Science Fiction series here. For CJ Cherry's The Gate of Ivriel. I love all the covers he did for that series as well. There is the Elric cover and also the cover for the album from Cirith Ungol. the Sepultura cover, the Meatloaf cover. Pierce Anthony, one of the Xanth novels there. I think the first Xanth novel, right? Spell for Chameleon. I would love to live in a world created by Michael Whelan. He really just gets to kind of like the heart of like what I love in fantasy. That is awesome. The Eagles are coming. I mean, that is just so epic. I can just feel this, the heat, the exhaustion, the triumph. Ah, man, what a beautiful painting. And then we have this really nice splash page here. And then we get into that final section, which is a section on 99 different artists, a small write-up of each one with some example of their art. I really like this section a lot. It's a really good section to learn a lot about, a little bit about a lot of artists. Simon Bisley is another artist who I would have substituted in maybe for Giger. I think Simon Bisley's art is, I feel like he's often overlooked even though he's popular. It's kind of a weird. Roger Dean. Roger Dean would have been a really good artist to include as well. All the album covers he did. Ken Kelly. I have a collection of cards. I have some artist cards by Ken Kelly. I really like his stuff. So he did some Conan covers. Ken Kelly kind of reminds me of the missing link between in styles between like Frazetta and Vallejo. You have Frazetta, Kelly, Vallejo. Kind of like a lineage there, I think. Yeah, all kinds of cool stuff to learn from here. I have to wonder if this was for Bender from Futurama. I mean, it looks exactly like him there. I've always wondered that. And of course, you recently lost some really great artists, Neil Adams and George Perez. George Perez, my favorite comic book artist of all time, American comic, or not American, but superhero, I should say, superhero comic book artist. Rest in peace, George Perez. He made some great art. But yeah, so that was a look at the Taschen masterpieces of fantasy art book. I hope you guys enjoy taking a look at this art, and we will talk to you later. Bye-bye.